Hello and welcome. Before we begin, I invite you to gently set the volume to a comfortable level, close your eyes, and simply lie still in silence. Let the world slow down around you. Together, we will drift softly into rest. Tonight, we start our first quiet journey through history, the story of the Indus Valley Civilization, a calm and unhurried tale told not to excite, but to ease you into sleep. If you find peace in these gentle stories, please remember to like this video and subscribe so that you can return here whenever you need rest. Now, let us begin. The story of the Indus Valley Civilization begins long ago, in a time before the world was filled with the bustle of great empires and the roar of armies marching across continents. It begins in a quieter place, where rivers flowed slowly across wide plains, carrying water that turned the land into one of the earliest homes of settled life. The Indus River, together with its tributaries, shaped the land in what is now modern Pakistan and northwestern India. Around its banks, some of the first cities in human history would rise, and even though their people left behind no grand monuments like pyramids or colossal statues, they created something equally remarkable, a way of life built on order, trade, and subtle harmony. To imagine the Indus Valley, let us drift back 5,000 years. The world then was simpler, yet in its own way, just as complex as ours. The people of the Indus built their homes out of baked bricks, carefully shaped to fit together. Streets stretched in straight lines, meeting at right angles, like a pattern drawn on the earth. It was not the chaos of scattered huts, but the quiet precision of planning. Imagine walking slowly through such a city at dusk. The air would be warm, touched by the smell of earth after the river's floodwaters receded. The houses would stand close to one another, 2 stories high, with flat roofs where families might sit in the evening to watch the stars. There was little noise, no shouting, no rumble of carts in crowded markets, only the low sounds of life, children playing softly, women grinding grain, men returning home from their work. What is striking is not just the presence of buildings, but their uniformity. Archaeologists discovered that the bricks used in these cities were of almost identical size and proportion. This suggests a standard system, a sense of shared rules followed by all. Even the drains beneath the streets were carefully laid, channeling water away so that the city would remain clean. For a moment, think of how rare that was. In many later civilizations, sanitation was often neglected. Yet here, thousands of years earlier, people paid careful attention to hygiene and public order. As you picture these quiet streets, you may notice something unusual: the absence of temples or palaces towering above the rest. Unlike Egypt with its pyramids, or Mesopotamia with its ziggurats, the Indus people left no evidence of kings or monumental gods carved into stone. Their society seems to have valued a quieter balance, one where no single ruler dominated the skyline. It was as if the people lived not under the shadow of one man's power, but within a shared rhythm that belonged to all. Their writing, carved into small seals and etched on pottery, has not yet been fully understood. Each symbol is a mystery, like whispers from the past that we cannot quite hear. We see the shapes, tiny animals, geometric signs, perhaps words of trade or prayers, but we do not know their sound. This silence of the Indus script deepens the sense of calm, as if their story remains locked, waiting for us to drift slowly through its fragments without the noise of certainty. Life in the Indus Valley was connected deeply with water. The rivers flooded predictably, leaving fertile soil. Farmers grew barley, wheat, peas, and sesame. They tended to cattle, sheep, and water buffalo, guiding them to graze in the meadows. In quiet workshops, artisans shaped beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli, shining stones traded across lands far away. From their docks at the city of Lothal, small boats may have sailed down to the Arabian Sea, carrying goods to distant shores. The rhythm of this civilization was not war but trade. Its power was not expressed in conquest, but in the steady hum of markets and the silent precision of craftsmen. Even in the stillness of night, one can imagine a faint glow from the workshops, where artisans carved tiny seals with images of bulls, elephants, and mysterious symbols, each one a mark of identity in a world of exchange. The most famous of their cities were Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro, whose name means Mound of the Dead, holds perhaps the most haunting remains. Its streets, still visible today, stretch in a grid, and its great bath, a large pool lined with bricks and bitumen, suggests that water held a ritual significance. Was it for purification or simply a place of gathering? We cannot know, but standing in that silent ruin, one feels the weight of forgotten lives. The Great Bath remains one of the oldest known public water tanks in history, a sign that the people cared not only for survival, but also for ritual and shared experience. As you listen, let your mind wander gently through these ruins. Picture the still pools of water, the straight streets where footsteps once echoed, the narrow lanes that twist between houses. Imagine the quiet discipline of a society that lasted for centuries, thriving without grand wars or monumental kings, a civilization that lived and faded with little noise. The Indus Valley reminds us that greatness does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, in bricks aligned with care, in drains that kept the streets clean, in seals that carried silent symbols, in the steady flow of rivers that nurtured life. In this quiet journey, the past is not a storm of battles, but a gentle current of order and balance. And as we drift with it, we too can feel the calm it offers, like a soft guide into sleep. To continue our journey through the Indus Valley, let us wander quietly into the daily rhythms of life that filled its streets and homes. Unlike the dramatic tales of kings and conquests that so often dominate history, the story of the Indus people is gentler, woven not from the noise of war, but from the steady patterns of ordinary living. Imagine, if you will, the morning beginning in one of their great cities, perhaps Mohenjo-daro. The sun rises over flat rooftops, spilling golden light onto narrow lanes. Families stir within brick houses, their interiors simple but thoughtfully arranged. There were rooms that opened to central courtyards, places where cooking fires burned low, where food was prepared with calm routine. The houses often had private wells and bathing areas, remarkable for such an ancient time. It tells us that cleanliness and water were deeply valued, not as luxuries for a few, but as essentials for many. In this world, the people did not merely endure, they lived with a quiet dignity. Step outside into the streets, and you would notice the remarkable order of their world. The avenues ran straight, crossing each other at right angles, suggesting not the haphazard growth of a village, but the careful design of minds that thought ahead. It was as if the entire city was built from a shared vision, a collective discipline that valued structure and balance. Carts drawn by oxen might roll along, carrying grain or clay jars. Merchants arranged goods in small open spaces, and artisans worked at their crafts. There was no towering palace to remind the people of power, only the daily exchange of life, goods traded, food shared, tools crafted with precision. The heart of the Indus Valley was trade. Their lands were fertile, their workshops skilled, and their connections stretched far. Archaeologists have found beads of carnelian, polished to a soft glow, that traveled from these plains to Mesopotamia. They have uncovered seals marked with animals, bulls, tigers, elephants, each bearing mysterious symbols that may have represented names, families, or merchants. These seals were like silent signatures, proof of identity in a world without coins or paper contracts. The goods carried from the Indus were not only practical, but beautiful. Beads, shells, ivory, and precious stones were shaped with patient hands. Pottery was painted with simple patterns, often in red or black, their designs echoing the natural world of rivers and fields. In workshops, craftsmen shaped copper and bronze, creating tools and ornaments, while others spun cotton into cloth, perhaps some of the earliest woven textiles known to humanity. Cotton garments must have felt light and cool in the heat of the Indus Plains, offering comfort as well as function. Life here was built on steady routines. Farmers tended fields of wheat and barley, watching the rhythm of the river floods. Shepherds guided flocks of sheep and goats to graze. Families ground grain into flour, baked flat bread, cooked lentils, and prepared food that was plain but nourishing. The city thrived on these cycles, each person contributing to a larger whole. There was no need for grand declarations. The civilization spoke through its order, its cleanliness, and its enduring balance. And yet, amidst the simplicity, there was also mystery. The writing of the Indus, still undeciphered, leaves us guessing at the thoughts of its people. Were the seals merely markers of trade, or did they also carry prayers, laws, or stories? The silence of these symbols is perhaps what makes the Indus so fascinating. It is a civilization we can see and touch through its ruins, but one whose voice remains hidden, Let us imagine for a moment a traveler from Mesopotamia arriving at the docks of Lothal. He would find a city with a large basin, perhaps a dockyard, where boats were anchored. Goods were loaded and unloaded with quiet efficiency. Spices, stones, beads, and textiles may have been exchanged for silver, wool, or other treasures from the West. The air would be filled not with the clamor of shouting, but with the steady work of trade, the rhythm of life moving like the current of the river. The traveler might marvel at the cleanliness of the streets, the regularity of the houses, the absence of towering temples or kings. Instead, he would see a people who lived by cooperation, who seemed to place value on community rather than hierarchy. Perhaps he would sense the quiet strength of a society that endured for centuries, not by conquest, but by adaptation, by order, and by trade. As evening falls again in the Indus Valley, families might gather on rooftops, enjoying the cooler air. Lamps, fueled by oil, would flicker gently. Children would drift to sleep as parents spoke softly of harvests and markets. The sound of the river, ever present, would blend with the quiet hum of the city. It was not a world without challenges. Floods, droughts, and changes in the river's course surely tested them. But for centuries they endured, quietly thriving in the balance between land and water. In reflecting on this civilization, one cannot help but notice the calm dignity of their achievements. No armies marched to carve their names into stone. No kings left grand inscriptions. Instead, they built cities of remarkable order. They mastered the art of sanitation. They wove cotton. They traded across seas, and they lived within the rhythm of nature. Their story drifts to us as a whisper from the past, inviting us to listen not to the noise of power, but to the silence of balance. And in that silence, as we let our minds imagine the gentle streets, the steady workshops, and the soft glow of lamps at dusk, we too may feel a calmness rising, carrying us gently toward rest. As we drift deeper into the story of the Indus Valley civilization, our attention moves from the physical order of its streets and workshops to the quieter, more mysterious side of its culture and beliefs. What did these people worship? What ideas shaped their lives? And how did they find meaning in the world around them? The answers are subtle, hidden not in grand temples or vast inscriptions, but in small objects, carved figures, and the silent symbols left behind. Unlike Egypt, where pyramids reached to the sky, or Mesopotamia, where temples towered above the plains, the Indus cities reveal no massive shrines to gods or kings. Instead, their religious and spiritual life seems to have been woven gently into daily existence. Archaeologists have uncovered small terracotta figurines, many of them representing women. These figures, with exaggerated features, are thought by some to symbolize fertility, the nurturing force of life and continuity. In a land where crops and animals sustain the community, it is not difficult to imagine that fertility, growth, and abundance were sacred concepts. Alongside these figurines, seals bearing images of animals provide further clues. One of the most famous shows a seated figure with horns, surrounded by animals, in a pose that resembles meditation or yogic posture. Some scholars believe this may be an early form of a deity linked to fertility, animals, or even a precursor to later Hindu gods. Whether this figure truly represents a god or a symbolic role is uncertain, but it speaks to a culture that saw a connection between humans, animals, and the wider natural world. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro adds another layer of mystery. It was a large, carefully constructed pool, sealed to hold water, with steps leading down from all sides. Its size and central location suggest it was not simply for bathing, but for ritual. Perhaps the people gathered here for purification, for ceremonies linked to water, or for collective gatherings. The fact that such effort went into its construction reminds us of the deep importance of water, not only for survival, but for the spirit. In their art and symbols, animals appear again and again. Bulls, elephants, tigers, and mythical creatures decorate their seals. These may have been used for trade, pressed into clay as marks of ownership, but they may also have carried protective or spiritual meaning. To see a seal with a powerful bull was not only to recognize a merchant's identity, but perhaps also to invoke strength, endurance, and prosperity. The undeciphered script of the Indus adds to the sense of quiet wonder. Over 4,000 symbols have been found, scratched onto pottery, carved into seals, and inscribed on tools. They are short, often just a few characters, and despite decades of study, no one has unlocked their meaning. They stand as whispers from the past, frozen in silence. Were they names, prayers, records of trade, or something entirely different? The truth is hidden, and in that silence, our imagination drifts gently, picturing a world where knowledge and meaning flowed in ways we can no longer see. What is also striking is the absence of monuments to rulers. No statues of kings, no carvings of battles, no inscriptions celebrating conquests. The civilization appears to have been organized without the heavy imprint of one man's power. This has led scholars to wonder whether the Indus Valley was guided more by councils, by community decisions, or by a balance of local leaders rather than by emperors. Such a thought adds to the quiet harmony of their world, a society that thrived for centuries without loud proclamations of glory. Cultural life likely included music, dance, and storytelling, though we can only imagine their forms. Simple instruments, such as flutes carved from bone, suggest melodies carried across the evening air. Children may have danced in courtyards, imitating the movements of animals, while elders passed along stories of rivers, seasons, and ancestors. Even without written texts, culture would have flowed in voices, gestures, and rituals, softly shaping each generation. Jewelry and ornamentation also played a role in daily life. Beads of carnelian, steatite, and faience were strung into necklaces and bracelets. Shell bangles have been found in graves, showing that adornment was part of both life and death. These small objects reflect not only beauty, but also identity, status, and connection to the wider world of trade. In thinking about the Indus people, one must embrace the calm of uncertainty. We know enough to see their order, their craftsmanship, their trade, and their rituals, but so much remains unknown. Their gods, their songs, their stories are like faint echoes in the distance. Yet perhaps it is this silence that makes their civilization so soothing to study. It does not shout at us with clear declarations. It invites us to listen quietly, to drift into speculation, to rest in the gentle mystery of what cannot be fully explained. As night falls over the ancient plains, picture again the rooftops of Mohenjo-Daro. Lamps glow softly, the air is filled with the faint sound of flutes, and the river flows endlessly in the distance. Families gather, wearing beads that shine in the firelight, telling stories we can no longer hear. Their civilization, though long gone, continues to whisper across time, reminding us that life need not always be loud to be meaningful. And in that quiet reminder, we too can find rest. As we drift further along our quiet journey, we come to the question that lingers over all ancient civilizations. How did it end? The Indus Valley civilization, which flourished for centuries in calm balance, eventually faded away, leaving behind empty streets, abandoned homes, and silent seals. Unlike the dramatic collapses of empires marked by war or invasion, the decline of the Indus was subtle, a slow unraveling that remains partly hidden in mystery. To understand this decline, we must imagine the fragile balance upon which their world rested. The Indus River was both a giver of life and a source of challenge. Its floods nourished the land, but they could also destroy. Over time, the shifting of rivers may have altered the fertile plains. Some channels dried, others changed course, leaving once prosperous areas without water. For a society so dependent on the rhythm of floods, even small changes could have meant failed harvests, dwindling food supplies, and migration in search of better land. Archaeological evidence suggests that many cities, including Mohenjo-Daro, faced repeated flooding. Layers of silt found in the ruins indicate that waters rose and receded again and again, forcing people to rebuild. Perhaps after generations of struggle, the cost of staying became too high. Families may have packed their belongings, leaving behind homes of brick and streets once full of life. Imagine the quiet scene of departure. Doors closed, wells left unused, the sound of footsteps fading as people walked away toward the east. Another factor may have been climate. Studies of ancient sediments and tree rings suggest that the region experienced a gradual drying around 4,000 years ago. The monsoons, once generous, weakened. Rivers shrank. Fields that had once yielded wheat and barley may have withered under the sun. Without water, the carefully planned cities could not survive. Imagine the once flowing Indus reduced to a trickle, its fields cracked and dry, the people watching helplessly as their lifelines slipped away. Trade too may have faltered. For centuries, the Indus connected with Mesopotamia, exchanging beads, stones, and cotton for silver and wool. But if rivers shifted and ports like Lothal silted up, the routes of exchange would have broken. Without trade, artisans lost their markets, and workshops fell silent. A civilization built on steady commerce found itself cut off, its strength slowly draining away. Some theories suggest the arrival of new groups of people, perhaps Indo-Aryans moving into the subcontinent. While there is little evidence of violent conquest, their presence may have shifted cultural balances, blending traditions, or displacing older ways. Over time, the language, rituals, and patterns of life in the region changed, leaving the distinct character of the Indus cities behind. What is haunting is the gradual nature of this decline. There is no evidence of burning, no mass graves of war, no monuments torn down by invaders. Instead, the city simply emptied. The bricks remained, the drains and baths stood in silence, but the people were gone. It was as if life slowly drifted away, like a river losing its flow. Picture Mohenjo-Daro in its last days. The streets are quieter, fewer carts pass by, the wells are used less often. The great bath, once filled with water and ritual, lies empty, its floor cracked. Houses are abandoned, their roofs collapsing under the weight of neglect. Children no longer play in the courtyards. Merchants no longer stamp their seals in clay. What was once a vibrant hum of order becomes a stillness that grows year after year until nothing is left but silence. This silence has reached across millennia. Today, when archaeologists walk through the ruins, they find themselves surrounded by walls and streets that remain strangely intact, yet without voices to explain them. The people left no great text to describe their fall, no stone carvings to explain their sorrow. They simply disappeared, leaving us only with questions. Why did they not rebuild elsewhere? Did they scatter into smaller villages, blending into the rural life that continued across the subcontinent? Did their culture survive quietly in fragments, passed on in customs and rituals that may still echo faintly in India today? These mysteries remain unanswered. Yet perhaps this quiet ending holds a lesson. Civilizations need not collapse in fire and conquest. Sometimes they fade softly, like the receding tide, leaving behind not destruction, but emptiness. The Indus Valley reminds us that human achievement, no matter how orderly, rests upon the fragile balance of nature. Rivers shift, climates change, and even the most carefully planned cities cannot endure forever. And yet, though the people vanished, their legacy remains. The bricks, the drains, the seals, the great bath, all of these continue to whisper of a society that valued order, cleanliness, and community. Their silence is not emptiness, but an invitation to imagine. It allows us to walk slowly through their streets in our minds, to feel the calm dignity of a civilization that once thrived in harmony with its rivers. As we let this story settle, it feels like a gentle reminder that all things, even the grandest, are temporary. What matters is not how loudly a civilization proclaims its power, but how quietly it leaves its mark. The Indus Valley left its mark in silence, and in that silence, as we drift with the story, we too can find rest. For thousands of years after the Indus Valley civilization faded into silence, its memory was lost to time. Unlike Egypt, where pyramids stood proudly as reminders of a glorious past, or Mesopotamia, where clay tablets preserved names and kings, the Indus left no such monuments to fix them in history. Their cities lay buried under layers of earth, forgotten, their story erased from human memory. Villages grew over their ruins, farmers plowed fields above their streets, and travelers passed without knowing that beneath their feet lay one of the world's first great civilizations. The rediscovery came only in modern times, by accident, and with it the quiet voices of the Indus began to whisper again. In the mid-19th century, when British engineers were building railways across India, they came across large, uniform bricks scattered across the land. These bricks were unusual, perfectly shaped and hardened, far older than any structures nearby. The workers collected them, using them as convenient building material for tracks and bridges. Without realizing it, they were dismantling the remains of ancient cities, carting away the very stones that once formed walls, wells, and homes of the Indus people. It was only later, as scholars grew curious, that the true significance of these bricks became clear. Archaeologists began excavating sites such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the early 20th century. What they uncovered stunned the world. Beneath layers of earth, streets appeared, straight and orderly, paved with bricks that had lain untouched for millennia. Houses emerged, still aligned in neat rows. Drains ran beneath the streets, carefully constructed to carry waste away. Wells were uncovered, courtyards revealed, staircases led to upper floors long collapsed. As the dust of centuries lifted, a city took shape once more. The discovery of Mohenjo-Daro in particular revealed a city unlike anything expected. The Great Bath, with its watertight bricks, was uncovered step by step, each layer showing the engineering skill of a forgotten people. Rows of granaries, platforms, and residential blocks appeared. The archaeologists walked through these streets as if entering a ghost city. Intact but silent, its people long gone, yet its presence still strong. The discovery forced the world to rethink history. Until then, scholars had believed that civilization in South Asia began much later, influenced by Mesopotamia. But the Indus revealed itself as a civilization equal in age to Egypt and Mesopotamia, contemporary with them, independent and unique. Its cities were not the shadows of others but original, with their own systems of writing, trade, and ritual. The rediscovery also brought mysteries. The seals with their strange symbols puzzled scholars from the very beginning. They looked like writing, yet no one could read them. Decades passed, theories were proposed, but still the script remained silent. Each excavation revealed more seals, more inscriptions, but none long enough to unlock their meaning. To this day, the Indus script remains undeciphered, one of the great unsolved puzzles of archaeology. Walking through these ruins today is a haunting experience. At Mohenjo-Daro, the streets still run in straight lines. The foundations of homes still stand. The Great Bath still lies in silence. It is a city frozen in time, where the echo of footsteps seems almost possible, where the walls whisper faintly of lives once lived. Visitors describe the feeling not as one of grandeur, but of calm, as though the city's quiet dignity has endured across thousands of years. Harappa, too, offers its whispers. Though damaged by centuries of brick removal, its layout is visible. Its granaries and walls tell of a society once thriving. From these ruins, we piece together fragments of daily life, how they farmed, how they traded, how they lived with order and care. But the full story remains hidden, a puzzle with missing pieces. The rediscovery of the Indus Valley was not only an archaeological triumph, but also a reminder of how much human memory can forget. For centuries, entire nations lived above these ruins without knowing. Stories of kings, gods, and battles filled other traditions, while the quiet people of the Indus disappeared into silence. Only with the accidental discovery of bricks and the careful work of excavation did their world rise again into the light. And yet, even in rediscovery, the Indus remains elusive. Their language cannot be read, their rulers, if they had any, are unknown. Their religion is guessed at but not certain. They stand in history as a civilization both visible and invisible. Visible in bricks, drains, and streets. Invisible in thought, belief, and voice. Perhaps this is why their rediscovery feels almost dreamlike. To walk among their ruins is to stand between what is known and what is unknowable, to feel the presence of a great society without being able to fully grasp its soul. In that sense, the Indus continues to whisper, not loudly but softly, as though reminding us that history is not always about clarity, but also about mystery. As we let this part of the story settle, imagine standing at the edge of Mohenjo-Daro at sunset. The ruins stretch out in silence. The wind moves softly across the bricks, and the river glimmers faintly in the distance. You know that beneath your feet lies the story of thousands of lives, forgotten and rediscovered, still partly hidden. And in that quiet mystery, as you listen to their whispers, you too can drift gently toward rest. As we drift further into the story of the Indus Valley civilization, our thoughts naturally turn to what such an ancient world can still teach us today. Though it has been more than 4,000 years since their streets echoed with footsteps, the legacy of the Indus people lingers not only in bricks and ruins, but also in the quiet lessons they left behind. In their silence, there are reminders about order, balance, community, and the fragile relationship between humans and nature. Consider first the lesson of planning. The cities of the Indus were not the result of chance. They were carefully designed with straight streets, standardized bricks, and systems of sanitation that even later civilizations struggled to achieve. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveal an attention to detail that shows the value of foresight. To live in such an environment was to be surrounded by a sense of order, a rhythm that guided daily life. In our modern world, where cities often grow chaotically and struggle with waste, congestion, and pollution, the Indus reminds us that human settlements thrive when they are planned with care, not just for the present, but for generations to come. Another lesson lies in their relationship with water. The Great Bath, the wells in houses, the drains beneath the streets, all point to a society that valued cleanliness and understood the importance of managing water. For them, water was not only survival, but also ritual, a source of both physical and spiritual well-being. Today, as the world faces shortages and climate challenges, the example of the Indus teaches us the necessity of respecting water as a shared treasure. Their quiet focus on sanitation and hygiene suggests a wisdom that modern societies are still struggling to fully embrace. Equally striking is the apparent absence of kings or grand rulers. In most ancient civilizations, history is told through the deeds of leaders, the victories of generals, or the monuments of kings. But in the Indus, no statues of rulers dominate the ruins. No palaces overshadow the houses. No inscriptions proclaim the power of one man over many. Instead, the uniformity of bricks and the balance of city design hint at a society that valued cooperation, perhaps even collective decision-making. This suggests a lesson about power and humility. Greatness does not always come from domination. Sometimes it arises quietly from shared effort, from communities choosing order over chaos, without the need for constant display. Another whisper from the Indus lies in trade. Their civilization flourished not through conquest, but through exchange. Beads, stones, cotton, and pottery traveled far beyond their borders, reaching Mesopotamia and lands across the Arabian Sea. In return, they received goods from distant places, linking them to a wider world. Their prosperity was built on connection, not on isolation. This reminds us that strength often lies not in walls, but in bridges, not in keeping others out, but in engaging with them through fair and steady exchange. At the same time, the story of their decline carries a warning. The Indus people lived in harmony with their rivers, but when the rivers shifted and the climate changed, their world unraveled. Fields withered, floods destroyed, and slowly the civilization faded. This is a lesson about fragility, about the dependence of human life on the rhythms of nature. No matter how well a society plans, if it ignores the environment that sustains it, collapse may follow. For us today, facing rising seas, shifting climates, and the pressure of consumption, the quiet fall of the Indus is a reminder to live in balance with the earth, to respect its cycles, and to prepare with foresight rather than denial. Their undeciphered script also offers a curious lesson. Despite all our knowledge, the Indus still keeps its words secret. Their seals, marked with animals and symbols, speak to us only in silence. It is a reminder of humility, that even in a world filled with technology and science, there are still mysteries we cannot solve. The past holds secrets that resist us, teaching us patience and the acceptance that not everything can be known. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Indus Valley is the value of quiet strength. They did not leave behind towering monuments or dramatic stories of war, yet their civilization endured for centuries, sophisticated and calm. In a modern age where noise and spectacle often seem to dominate, their story whispers another path, the power of steadiness, of order, of dignity without display. As we reflect on these lessons, imagine yourself walking through their streets once more. The bricks are beneath your feet, the drains run silently at the edges, and the air is still. In the silence, you sense their wisdom, subtle but enduring, carried across thousands of years. Their story is not only about what they built, but about what they teach us now, to plan with care, to respect water, to value community, to trade with fairness, to live in balance with nature, and to accept the mysteries that remain. In this quiet journey, the Indus Valley civilization becomes more than ruins. It becomes a mirror, showing us not only who they were, but who we might become if we choose wisdom over noise, humility over pride, and balance over excess. And as you let these thoughts rest gently in your mind, you may feel yourself drifting, carried softly into sleep by the calm lessons of a civilization that once thrived in silence. When we think of the Indus Valley civilization, it is tempting to imagine it as an isolated world, existing quietly along the rivers of South Asia. Yet the truth is more intriguing. This civilization, though subtle and understated in its remains, was not cut off from the wider world. It lived at the same time as the pyramids of Egypt were rising under the pharaohs, and as the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were being built by Sumerian kings. And though the Indus people left no written histories for us to read, the objects uncovered from their cities reveal a civilization that was connected, trading and exchanging ideas across distant lands. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from the tiny carved seals of the Indus. Many of these seals, marked with animals and symbols, have been found not only in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, but also in Mesopotamia. They appear in cities like Ur and Uruk, carried by merchants who traveled across deserts and seas. To find an Indus seal in Mesopotamia is to realize that these two great civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, once touched through trade. Imagine the journey, a boat setting out from the port of Lothal on the western edge of the Indus world, sailing down into the Arabian Sea, hugging the coastlines, and eventually reaching the Persian Gulf. From there, goods would move inland, carried by traders to the bustling markets of Mesopotamian cities. The Indus people exported beads of carnelian, polished to a warm red glow, shells carved into ornaments, cotton textiles woven with care, and perhaps even spices whose fragrances drifted across ancient markets. In return, they may have received silver, tin, wool, and luxury items that their own land did not produce. The connection was not only of goods, but also of ideas, for trade always carries with it stories, customs, and practices. To imagine a Mesopotamian merchant holding an Indus bead is to glimpse the quiet threads of globalization that already existed thousands of years ago. The Indus Valley may also have had indirect links with Egypt, though the evidence is fainter. The timing aligns, for while the Indus thrived, Egyptian pharaohs built pyramids and organized their society along the Nile. Both civilizations shared an intimate relationship with rivers, relying on their floods for fertile soil. Both produced intricate jewelry, used seals or symbols to mark identity, and developed systems of trade that stretched beyond their homelands. Though no Indus artifacts have been found directly in Egypt, it is possible that goods moved through Mesopotamia as intermediaries, traveling farther than the merchants themselves might have realized. The Indus also had connections within the wider South Asian world. Their trade routes extended into the foothills of the Himalayas, where they obtained lapis lazuli and other precious stones. From the deserts of Baluchistan, they may have collected unique shells and minerals. From the Deccan Plateau, perhaps they received metals or semi-precious stones. Their network was wide, connecting mountains, plains, coasts, and seas. What is striking is that all of this was achieved without evidence of armies or conquest. Unlike the Mesopotamians who recorded wars or the Egyptians who celebrated victories on temple walls, the Indus people seem to have built their connections through exchange rather than through domination. Their power lay in what they produced and in the trust carried by their seals. In this sense, the Indus offers a different model of greatness, one not built on violence, but on commerce, not carved in battlefields, but carried gently along rivers and seas. Archaeologists believe that these connections were essential to the prosperity of the Indus Valley. The wealth of imported materials enriched their artisans, allowing them to craft objects that still astonish us with their detail. A single bead of carnelian might pass through many hands before reaching its final owner in a distant city, yet it began in the workshops of the Indus. Shaped by tools and patience, such objects were not only beautiful, but also symbols of identity and status. The presence of Indus goods abroad shows that their civilization was not invisible to the ancient world. They were known, their work valued, their style distinct. And yet, they did not seem to seek domination or expansion. Their cities remained where the rivers flowed. Their influence carried outward quietly through trade. This reminds us that history is not only the story of those who fought, but also of those who connected, who traded, who built bridges instead of walls. As we imagine these connections, let us picture the calm waters of the Arabian Sea at dusk. Small boats laden with goods drifting slowly toward distant shores. The waves carry not only objects, but also the presence of a civilization whose whispers reached far beyond its rivers. In the stillness of night, those boats continue their journey, silent witnesses to the truth that even the quietest civilizations leave marks across the world. The Indus Valley, though mysterious and understated, was part of a wider network of human life, a thread in the great fabric of early civilizations. And in recognizing these connections, we understand not only their story, but also the calm reminder that humanity has always been linked, even in the earliest days, by rivers, seas, and the simple act of exchange. When we step quietly into the artistic world of the Indus Valley civilization, we find a culture that expressed itself not with colossal statues or massive monuments, but with the subtle beauty of small objects crafted with care. Their art is found in beads, seals, pottery, ornaments, and figurines, each one carrying a piece of their aesthetic vision. It was an art not meant to overwhelm, but to accompany life, woven gently into daily existence, reflecting both function and beauty. Among their most remarkable creations are the beads, many made of carnelian, agate, steatite, or faience. These beads were drilled with astonishing precision using tools that seem advanced for their time. Long carnelian beads, sometimes heat-treated to deepen their red color, were strung into necklaces that must have gleamed in the sunlight. The patience required to create these tiny, polished pieces shows the skill of artisans who worked not for spectacle, but for quiet perfection. Jewelry was common, found in graves and homes, suggesting that adornment was not limited to the wealthy but was a shared part of life. Bracelets made of shells, necklaces of semi-precious stones, and bangles of copper have been uncovered. Even children may have worn beads, reflecting a society where beauty touched every level of life. The figurines of the Indus also speak softly of their beliefs and daily practices. Terracotta figures shaped into animals, carts, and humans have been discovered. Many of the female figurines, with elaborate headdresses and detailed features, are thought to represent fertility or household goddesses. Some may have been toys for children, others objects of ritual, their forms blurring the line between play and spirituality. In these small, fragile figures, we glimpse the imagination of a people who shaped clay with both reverence and affection. Pottery was another canvas for their art. Painted in red and black, their vessels often carried geometric designs, trees, birds, and simple motifs. While not as elaborate as the decorated pottery of some other cultures, their designs had a quiet rhythm, repeating patterns that echo the orderliness of their cities. Each pot, though used for storage or cooking, was also an object of aesthetic value, turning necessity into beauty. The seals remain perhaps the most iconic artistic achievement of the Indus Valley. Square in shape, carved from steatite, they often depict animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and mythical creatures. Some feature a figure seated in meditation, surrounded by animals, a scene that may carry spiritual meaning. These seals were not only practical, used to mark goods in trade, but also deeply expressive, their carvings delicate and intricate. To hold one in your hand is to touch both art and identity, a symbol of a civilization that prized both function and beauty. Even their weights and measures reflected a sense of order and design. Made of chert, carefully shaped into cubes, they show not only mathematical precision, but also a respect for symmetry and balance. To the Indus people, measurement was not only practical, but almost artistic in its consistency, creating a shared language of trade and trust. What is striking about Indus art is its scale. Unlike the massive statues of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus left behind no monumental sculptures. Their expression was intimate, found in the small and personal. This does not make their art lesser. Rather, it shows a different vision of beauty. It was not about towering over others, but about living surrounded by objects of quiet elegance. Their aesthetic world was woven into life itself, inseparable from work, play, ritual, and trade. Music too may have been part of this artistic life, though little evidence survives. A few flutes carved from bone have been discovered, their simple holes suggesting that melodies once floated across the rooftops at dusk. Perhaps children danced to their sound, or rituals were accompanied by soft music in the courtyards. The thought of such music, now vanished, adds to the dreamlike quality of the Indus, reminding us that much of their art was ephemeral, carried in sound, gesture, and performance, rather than stone. As we imagine their aesthetic world, picture a household in Mohenjo-Daro. A woman strings beads into a necklace, a child plays with a terracotta cart, a pot painted with black designs holds grain, and a seal is pressed into clay to mark ownership. Around them, beauty and function merge seamlessly. Their art was not separate from life but part of it, filling every corner with quiet dignity. In reflecting on the art and craft of the Indus Valley, we are reminded that civilization is not only measured by monuments, but also by the care given to small things. A bead, a pot, a seal, each carries within it the voice of a people who valued precision, beauty, and meaning in daily existence. Their art does not shout. It whispers. It does not seek to dominate the horizon. It seeks to enrich the moment. And in these whispers of clay, stone, and carnelian, we find a civilization that understood the gentle power of beauty woven into life. As you let this image settle, imagine holding an Indus bead in your hand, feeling its smoothness, seeing its subtle glow. It is small, yet it carries the presence of an entire civilization, a quiet echo across thousands of years. And in that quiet, as you reflect on their art, you too may drift softly toward rest. To understand the Indus Valley civilization more fully, we must move beyond its ruins and imagine the rhythms of daily life, the quiet routines that sustained its people from sunrise to nightfall. Though the centuries have erased their voices, the remains of their cities allow us to picture how men, women, and children lived within the order of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. A day in the Indus began early, with the first light of dawn touching the flat rooftops of baked brick houses. Families lived in homes that often rose 2 stories high, with central courtyards that caught the morning air. In these courtyards, fires were lit and simple meals prepared. Grain stored in large jars was ground into flour, and bread was baked on flat stones. Women tended to food preparation, grinding pulses, cooking lentils, and shaping bread, while men prepared for their work in fields, workshops, or markets. Children might play with toys of clay, small carts with wheels, miniature animals, or rattles. The sound of laughter would have echoed softly through the lanes, a gentle counterpoint to the work of adults. Water was drawn from private wells or from public sources along the streets. The Indus people valued cleanliness, and most houses had bathing areas with drains leading into the carefully planned sewage system beneath the city. To bathe each day was not only practical, but likely ritual, a way of beginning the day with freshness. This concern for hygiene set them apart from many later civilizations and suggests a culture that placed great importance on the order of body and spirit alike. Outside the houses, the streets came alive with quiet industry. Merchants opened their stalls, artisans took up their tools, and oxen pulled carts loaded with goods. Workshops produced beads, pottery, textiles, and ornaments, while farmers brought produce into the city. Cotton cloth, one of their distinctive contributions to the world, may have been traded alongside wheat, barley, and sesame oil. Markets were modest in scale compared to the bustling bazaars of later times, but they were filled with the hum of exchange, the steady rhythm of trade that kept the civilization alive. The social life of the Indus seems to have been less marked by hierarchy than in other ancient lands. The uniformity of housing bricks and the absence of palaces suggest that daily life for most families was not overshadowed by kings or nobles. Instead, life unfolded with a sense of equality, each household contributing to the community. That does not mean all were the same, for some houses were larger, indicating greater wealth, and the ornaments found in certain graves suggest differences in status. Yet the contrast was gentler than in civilizations where kings ruled from palaces above their subjects. Meals were simple but nourishing. Bread from barley or wheat, lentils, peas, and sesame formed the basis of the diet. Meat from cattle, sheep, or goats may have been eaten occasionally, along with fish from the rivers. Spices such as mustard seeds might have flavored their food, adding taste to the daily fare. The presence of storage jars and granaries indicates that food was carefully preserved and distributed, ensuring that communities had supplies across seasons. Evenings brought a change in rhythm. Families gathered on rooftops where the air was cooler. Stories may have been told, flutes played, and beads strung into necklaces by lamplight. Children listened to the voices of elders, learning traditions that we can no longer hear. The night sky above the plains, unclouded by the noise of modern lights, must have been brilliant with stars, offering both wonder and comfort. Festivals and rituals likely punctuated the routine, though their form is hidden from us. The Great Bath suggests that water purification or communal ceremonies were part of life. Figurines hint at fertility rituals. perhaps connected to the agricultural cycle. Seals carved with animals may have carried protective meanings or marked clan identities. Though we cannot know the exact stories they told or the gods they worshipped, we can imagine that life was enriched by moments of collective celebration and reverence. Occupations in the Indus world were varied. Farmers cultivated the fertile floodplains, artisans crafted jewelry and pottery, merchants managed trade, and laborers built and maintained the streets, wells, and drains. Women likely managed households, prepared food, and wove cloth. Children learned through imitation, helping in small ways until they could take on adult roles. There may have been teachers, healers, or ritual leaders, though their presence is suggested only by fragments of evidence. What is clear is that life was organized, each person contributing to the rhythm of society. The absence of weapons in large numbers suggests that daily life was not dominated by war. Instead, the people focused on sustaining themselves, on trading, on crafting, and on living with dignity. In this way, the Indus Valley offers us a picture of a civilization where ordinary life was the center, not the noise of rulers or battles. As we let this picture form in our minds, imagine walking through an Indus neighborhood at dusk. The bricks under your feet are warm from the sun. The smell of bread drifts from courtyards. Children's laughter fades into quiet as night descends. Lamps flicker in windows, the streets grow still, and the city rests in order and peace. Daily life in the Indus Valley was not about spectacle, but about steady rhythms, small acts repeated with care. And it is in those rhythms, preserved in the ruins, that we find the true strength of their civilization. Their legacy is not only in bricks and drains, but in the memory of lives lived with balance, dignity, and quiet purpose. As our quiet journey through the Indus Valley civilization draws to a close, it is time to gather the threads of what we have seen and reflect on what this ancient world still means to us. For many centuries, the Indus lay hidden, its people forgotten, its cities buried. Yet through ruins, artifacts, and the patient work of archaeologists, we have glimpsed a civilization that was unique in its calm strength. The Indus Valley was not a land of towering kings or boastful monuments. It left behind no grand tales of war, no sprawling palaces of stone carved with victories. Instead, it built its legacy on order, on community, on trade, on a respect for water and cleanliness, on an art that whispered rather than shouted. And in its silence, we find a different vision of greatness, one that is measured not by conquest, but by balance. When we think back on their cities, we remember the straight streets, carefully aligned, the bricks of uniform size, the drains that carried waste away, and the wells that gave families fresh water. We remember the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, where ritual and water met in quiet dignity. We remember the seals carved with bulls, elephants, and symbols we cannot read, fragments of a language that still waits to be understood. We remember the beads, polished with such precision, the pottery painted with steady hands, the jewelry worn by both rich and poor. These objects speak not only of survival, but of an aesthetic life, a culture that found beauty in the small and the functional. We also recall their trade routes, stretching far beyond the Indus Plains, reaching Mesopotamia and perhaps beyond. Their beads and cotton cloth traveled to foreign markets. Their seals carried their mark into distant lands. Through trade, they connected quietly with the wider world, a reminder that even in ancient times, civilizations were linked by exchange, by goods, by ideas. And yet we cannot forget the mystery of their decline. Climate shifts, river changes, and the slow unraveling of balance ended their great cities. They did not fall in fire or conquest, but faded like a tide retreating, leaving behind emptiness. This is a lesson for us, that human achievement, no matter how advanced, depends on harmony with the environment. And when that harmony breaks, civilizations falter. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Indus is what we do not know. Their script remains undeciphered, their gods unnamed, their stories unheard. We can walk their streets in imagination, see their houses and markets, but their voices are silent. This silence, though frustrating to scholars, is strangely calming. It invites us not to chase only answers, but to accept mystery, to find peace in the unknown. In this way, the Indus speaks to us as no other civilization does. It does not overwhelm us with declarations. It invites us to listen to whispers. As we reflect, we find lessons both practical and philosophical. We see the value of planning, of sanitation, of respecting water. We see the strength of trade and cooperation over war and conquest. We see the fragility of human life against the power of nature. And we see the dignity of a society that thrived for centuries in balance, only to fade softly into silence. In thinking of them, we also think of ourselves. Our world, busy and noisy, filled with lights and machines, often forgets the quiet wisdom of the past. Yet the Indus reminds us that greatness need not roar. It can be steady, measured, clean, and ordered. It can be found in small objects made with care, in communities that live with dignity, in societies that balance beauty with function. Their story is not only ancient, it is timeless. As you let these reflections rest in your mind, imagine once more walking through Mohenjo-daro at twilight. The streets are still, the houses empty, the great bath silent. Yet in the silence you feel presence, the echo of thousands of lives lived with purpose. The wind moves softly across the ruins, the stars shine above just as they did for the Indus people, and you realize that though they are gone, their whispers remain. This is the gift of history, not always clear answers, but gentle reminders of what it means to live. And so, as we close this journey, let the calm of the Indus Valley stay with you. Let its quiet order guide you into stillness. Let its mysteries ease your thoughts away from noise. The story of the Indus has no ending carved in stone, only a soft fading like the slow dimming of a lamp. And as we too fade into rest, may their silence carry you into sleep, deep and untroubled, where dreams flow like rivers, and the ancient world drifts peacefully into the night. And so, our quiet story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next chapter, I gently ask you for a like and a subscribe. It helps keep these calm journeys alive, and it means you can always return here whenever sleep feels far away. Now let us continue, drifting softly into the next tale in our series of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we arrive at the forgotten rituals of the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a people who lived long before the Roman Empire rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, and yet their story is often told only in fragments, whispered between the lines of Roman accounts or glimpsed through the artifacts left behind in their tombs. They flourished in central Italy, in the region known as Etruria, between the 8th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, creating a culture both mysterious and influential. Though much of their history has been overshadowed by the Romans who came after them, the rituals of the Etruscans remain among the most haunting reminders of a people who sought to understand the universe through ceremony, symbol, and sacred order. To imagine their world, let us drift back into the hills of ancient Italy, where forests stretched thick and rivers wound their way through valleys. The Etruscans built cities on hilltops, fortified with walls overlooking fertile plains where they farmed grain, olives, and vines. Their society was wealthy, enriched by trade across the Mediterranean. They exchanged goods with Greeks, Phoenicians, and later with Romans, bringing in pottery, wine, and luxury items, while exporting metals from their mines. This prosperity gave rise to elaborate rituals, both public and private, through which they sought to balance the human and the divine. One of the central features of Etruscan life was their deep concern with divination, the reading of signs to understand the will of the gods. The Etruscans believed that nothing in the world happened by chance, that every event carried meaning if one knew how to interpret it. They practiced haruspicy, the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially the liver. Priests known as haruspices studied the markings and shapes of livers, seeing in them messages from the gods. Clay models of livers have been found, inscribed with divisions that mapped out the heavens, suggesting that to the Etruscans, the body of an animal could serve as a mirror of the cosmos itself. This ritual was not done with haste or spectacle, but with solemnity, each detail considered carefully, as if the very fate of a city might rest on the curve of an organ. Alongside haruspicy, they practiced augury, the interpretation of the flight of birds. To an Etruscan augur, the sky was a canvas of divine communication. The direction, the number, the species of birds, each carried significance. A flock passing to the left might signal danger, while one flying to the right promised success. Through these rituals, the Etruscans believed they could align their actions with the will of higher powers, ensuring that temples were built in the right places, battles begun at the right time, and laws enacted under favorable signs. These practices remind us of a people who lived in close awareness of nature, seeing in every movement of the sky and earth the presence of the divine. The rituals of burial reveal even more about their culture. The Etruscans believed in an afterlife that mirrored earthly life, and their tombs were designed like houses for the dead, carved into rock or built as chambers underground. These tombs often contained painted walls showing scenes of banquets, music, and games. Within, families placed not only the bodies of their loved ones, but also the objects they might need beyond death: jewelry, weapons, tools, and pottery filled with food and drink. The rituals of burial were both farewell and continuation, ensuring that the departed could enter the next world with dignity and comfort. To walk into an Etruscan tomb today is to step into a world of silence where painted figures still dance on the walls, frozen in time, their gestures speaking of a belief that death was not an end, but a passage. Festivals, too, carried ritual weight. The Etruscans celebrated games that combined athletic contests with religious meaning. Gladiatorial combat, which later became infamous in Rome, is believed to have originated from Etruscan funerary rituals, where the blood of combatants honored the spirits of the dead. To the Etruscans, such rituals bound the community to the cycle of life and death, sacrifice and renewal. They did not see violence as mere entertainment, but as sacred offering, a way of balancing human life with the demands of the gods. Music and dance were also part of their rituals. Flutes, lyres, and drums accompanied ceremonies, their sounds echoing through temples and open-air gatherings. Dancers moved in rhythms that imitated the cycles of nature, turning ritual into performance, blending beauty with devotion. These acts were not isolated moments, but woven deeply into the social fabric, shaping the identity of the people. To reflect on the rituals of the Etruscans is to glimpse a world where every act carried sacred meaning. Whether reading the flight of birds, examining the signs in the liver of a sacrificial animal, painting tomb walls with visions of joy, or dancing in festivals of life and death, the Etruscans lived in a universe where the divine was never far away. Their rituals may now seem distant, their meanings partly lost, but they remind us of humanity's enduring desire to find order and purpose in the mysteries of existence. And so, as we let this first part of their story rest gently in our minds, we can feel the calm weight of history settling around us. The forgotten rituals of the Etruscans may be silent now, but their echoes reach us still, carrying us softly toward reflection and rest. The Etruscans lived in a world where the divine was not distant, but woven into the fabric of daily life. To them, every sound of thunder, every bird in flight, every strange mark upon the earth carried a message from the gods. Religion was not an occasional observance, but the constant background of existence, a system that guided their choices, their rituals, and their understanding of life and death. At the heart of their beliefs was the conviction that the universe was ordered according to the will of the gods, and that human beings could discern this will through ritual. The Etruscans believed that the gods revealed themselves through signs, and that by reading these signs correctly, one could act in harmony with the divine plan. This belief produced a rich and structured religious system, which the Romans later adopted and reshaped, carrying fragments of Etruscan thought into their own traditions. One of the most important concepts was that of fate, understood as something fixed and unchangeable, yet interpretable. The gods determined the length of a person's life and the destiny of a city. But through ritual, one could understand these boundaries and prepare accordingly. The Etruscans divided the heavens into regions, each belonging to a different deity, and they believed that lightning, clouds, or birds crossing the sky carried messages from those divine zones. Priests studied these phenomena with great care, for in their eyes the very sky was a book written by the gods. Their pantheon was vast, filled with deities both familiar and mysterious. Some of their gods were shared with neighboring peoples, while others were uniquely Etruscan. Tenea was their sky god, a figure of supreme authority, often compared to Zeus or Jupiter. Uni, a goddess of fertility and power, was seen as his consort and protector of family life. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, war, and craft, bore similarities to the Greek Athena, though she retained her own distinct character in Etruscan worship. Alongside these greater deities were countless spirits of nature, household gods, and chthonic beings who governed the underworld. To the Etruscans, the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and rituals ensured that the spirits of ancestors were respected and appeased. Their mythology, though not fully preserved, survives in fragments recorded later by Roman writers and in the art of tombs and artifacts. Scenes painted on walls show banquets in the afterlife, figures of demons guiding souls, and gods who govern the cycles of life and death. They imagined a universe alive with powers both protective and dangerous, where every human act required balance and ritual to remain in harmony with divine order. The Etruscans also developed sacred texts, known later by the Romans as the Etrusca Disciplina. These were not texts in the modern sense, but collections of ritual rules and teachings, handed down through generations of priests. They outlined the methods of divination, the ways to interpret lightning, the sacrifices required for different deities, and the boundaries of sacred spaces. To the Etruscans, religion was a science of signs, systematic and structured, as exact as any craft. Within this framework, ritual sacrifice played a central role. Animals were offered to the gods, their entrails examined for omens, their lives given as a bridge between human and divine. The haruspices, specialists in reading livers, became renowned across the Mediterranean, consulted not only by Etruscan leaders, but later by Roman generals and senators. Their art of divination became one of the most enduring legacies of Etruscan religion. Another aspect of their sacred beliefs was the attention to boundaries. The Etruscans believed that every space had to be defined and consecrated before it could be used. Temples were oriented according to the divisions of the heavens. Cities founded only after rituals marked their sacred perimeter. Even time itself was seen as divided into portions governed by the gods, with the lifespan of a city believed to be finite, destined to end once its allotted time had passed. This view gave their religion both solemnity and inevitability, a sense that all things moved within a divine order that humans could glimpse but never control. In their art, we find reflections of their myths and beliefs. Bronze mirrors show engraved images of gods and heroes, some drawn from Greek myth but reimagined through Etruscan eyes. Tomb paintings depict winged figures who guide souls into the underworld, guardians who ensure the passage of the dead. These images remind us that to the Etruscans, religion was not abstract, but vividly present in both life and death. The forgotten rituals of the Etruscans reveal a people deeply attuned to the unseen, living in a constant dialogue with the divine. Their gods were many, their rituals elaborate, their priests skilled in arts of interpretation. Though their language and myths have not survived in full, the fragments that remain allow us to sense their worldview, a universe alive with meaning, a world where humans were never alone, but always in the presence of forces greater than themselves. As we let these thoughts drift quietly through our minds, we feel the calm persistence of their faith. It whispers across the centuries, reminding us that even forgotten rituals carry lessons about how humans have always sought order, guidance, and connection with the mysteries of existence. And in that gentle reminder, we too may find a sense of calm, letting the story settle softly as we drift toward rest. Among the most striking legacies of the Etruscans are their funerary practices, for it is through their tombs that we glimpse much of what remains of their culture. Unlike many ancient peoples whose monuments were built to impress the living, the Etruscans poured immense care into the dwellings of the dead. Their necropolises, or cities of the dead, stretch across the hills of Tuscany and Lazio, silent stone cities mirroring the towns of the living. Within these underground chambers, carved into tufa rock or built with blocks of stone, the Etruscans recreated the world they knew, filling it with art, objects, and rituals that reveal their vision of life beyond death. The Etruscans believed strongly in an afterlife, one where the soul continued its journey in a realm that resembled earthly life, but was guided by divine powers. Death was not the end, but a transition, a passage into another existence. Their rituals reflected both reverence for the deceased and preparation for the next stage of being. When a person died, their body was placed with care in a tomb, often accompanied by grave goods. These objects included pottery filled with food and drink, jewelry, weapons, tools, and sometimes imported luxury items. The logic was simple yet profound. Just as in life one needed sustenance and possessions, so too would these be required in death. By placing these objects with the body, the living ensured that the dead would not want in the world beyond. The tombs themselves were remarkable in their construction. Some were simple chambers, but others were elaborate structures designed like houses, with carved furniture, painted walls, and multiple rooms for family members. In servitry, tombs were shaped like miniature homes, complete with carved beds, chairs, and even doorways. To step inside one today is to enter an echo of an ancient household, a place where the dead continued their existence in a space both familiar and sacred. The walls of many tombs were decorated with frescoes that give us a rare window into Etruscan beliefs. These paintings depict banquets, dancers, musicians, hunters, and athletes, suggesting that the afterlife was envisioned as a continuation of joyful and communal experiences. To the Etruscans, the dead did not vanish into shadow, but entered a realm of celebration, where they reclined at feasts, listened to music, and enjoyed the pleasures of life in an eternal setting. Yet, alongside these scenes of joy, there were also images of demons and guardians, figures with wings and frightening faces, guiding souls into the underworld. This dual imagery suggests that the Etruscans saw death as both a passage into comfort and a journey requiring protection, where supernatural beings played a role in escorting the soul. In their mythology, deities such as Charun, a demon with a hammer, and Vanth, a winged female spirit, appear as guides of the dead. They were not purely malevolent, but rather necessary presences, ensuring that souls reached their proper place. This reveals a complex vision of the afterlife, one where fear and comfort coexisted, reminding the living of the seriousness of death while also offering hope of continuity. Funerary rituals were also social events, binding communities together. Burials were accompanied by ceremonies, sacrifices, and possibly games in honor of the deceased. Some scholars believe that the tradition of gladiatorial combat, later adopted by Rome, began as part of Etruscan funerary rites, where bloodshed honored the spirits of the departed. Though grim to modern eyes, such acts carried deep meaning in their culture, symbolizing renewal and the strength of communal bonds. Another important aspect was the family tomb. Etruscans often buried generations together in large chambered tombs, creating a sense of continuity across time. The dead were not isolated but part of a lineage, their memory preserved within a sacred space that connected past, present, and future. This practice reflects the importance of ancestry and kinship in their society, reminding the living of their place within an unbroken chain of existence. In reflecting on Etruscan funerary practices, we are struck by the intimacy of their approach to death. They did not build cold monuments of stone to awe outsiders. Instead, they created warm spaces for the dead, decorated with scenes of life, music, and joy. Their vision of the afterlife was not distant or abstract, but close, familiar, and filled with human experience. Even today, to stand inside an Etruscan tomb is to feel that sense of nearness, as though the voices of the past linger in the painted walls and carved stone. These practices also remind us of the universality of death and the many ways humans have sought to give it meaning. For the Etruscans, the rituals of burial were not only about the dead, but about the living, about reaffirming the bonds of community, the importance of family, and the connection between this world and the next. Their tombs remain silent cities, but in their silence they tell us of a people who faced death with dignity, who sought to provide for their loved ones even beyond the grave, and who imagined an afterlife where joy and continuity prevailed. As we let these reflections drift into our thoughts, we may feel the quiet weight of their beliefs settling gently. The forgotten rituals of the Etruscans speak not only of a vanished culture, but of humanity's timeless desire to honor the dead, to find comfort in continuity, and to transform the mystery of death into a passage of meaning. And in that quiet reminder, as we close our eyes, we too can find rest, carried softly into stillness by the echoes of their ancient tombs. To understand the Etruscans more deeply, we must leave the silence of their tombs and step into the sacred spaces of their public life. Religion was not hidden away in secret corners, but expressed openly in ceremonies, temples, and festivals that bound communities together. In the Etruscan worldview, the city itself was a sacred entity, its walls and streets laid out only after careful rituals of divination. Every foundation stone was placed with the guidance of priests, for they believed that only by aligning human activity with the divine order could a settlement thrive. Their temples, though few survive in physical form, are known to us through descriptions by Roman writers and fragments of foundations uncovered by archaeologists. Etruscan temples stood on high podiums, often with deep front porches supported by columns, facing outward to the world. Unlike the Greek temples that inspired them, Etruscan temples emphasized the frontal approach, drawing worshippers directly into a space where rituals were performed. The interiors were divided into 3 chambers, often dedicated to a triad of deities. Statues of gods, made not of marble but of terracotta, adorned the roofs and interiors, their painted surfaces glowing in the light of offerings. Though the materials were less enduring than stone, the effect in their time must have been vivid, alive with color, form, and sacred presence. These temples were not only houses of gods, but also focal points of civic life, places where rituals ensured the health of the community. The role of priests was central. The Etruscans developed a complex priestly class skilled in interpreting signs from the gods. The haruspices examined the entrails of sacrificial animals, most famously the liver, to discern divine will. Their augurs watched the skies, reading the patterns of birds, lightning, and winds. Together, these priests acted as interpreters of the divine, guiding rulers and communities in every important decision. No war was declared, no city founded, no law enacted without their counsel. To the Etruscans, the priest's role was not peripheral, but essential, a bridge between humans and the cosmos. Their authority rested not on force but on knowledge, a sacred science of signs known as the Disciplina Etrusca. This discipline contained rules for divination, rituals for consecrating temples, and even guidelines for determining the lifespan of a city. To live in an Etruscan community was to live under the watchful interpretation of the priests, who ensured that human activity remained aligned with divine order. Public rituals filled the calendar with solemn and festive occasions. Sacrifices of animals were made to honor gods and ancestors, the blood of the offering believed to nourish the divine and restore balance. Libations of wine and oil were poured onto altars, incense burned to carry prayers upward. Music accompanied these rituals, with flutes and lyres creating rhythms that blended beauty with devotion. Dancers, adorned with masks and costumes, moved in patterns that echoed cycles of nature, embodying myths and divine stories in movement. Festivals marked agricultural cycles, harvests, and transitions of the seasons, reinforcing the bond between community, earth, and gods. These celebrations were not merely entertainment, but sacred duties, moments when the entire community participated in reaffirming their connection to the divine. The temple grounds themselves were considered sacred spaces, where the boundaries between human and divine were thin. Every act within them carried meaning, from the arrangement of offerings to the orientation of the building. Even the placement of statues and altars followed strict guidelines dictated by augurs, who divided the sky and earth into zones governed by particular gods. This attention to sacred geometry reveals a culture deeply committed to aligning earthly life with cosmic order. One of the most fascinating aspects of Etruscan public ritual was the blending of seriousness with joy. Their ceremonies were solemn acts of communication with the gods, yet they were also filled with music, feasting, and games. To honor the divine was not only to sacrifice, but also to celebrate, to bring the community together in shared acts of devotion that strengthened bonds among the living as much as with the gods. The presence of terracotta statues on temple roofs adds another dimension to our understanding. These figures, often painted and brightly decorated, looked out over the city, guardians that reminded all of divine oversight. Their fragility, since terracotta is easily broken, contrasts with the power they represented. This suggests that for the Etruscans, the material was less important than the ritual act itself, the continuous renewal of devotion through offerings, sacrifices, and prayers. The Romans, who absorbed so much from the Etruscans, later adopted many of these practices. Roman augurs, Roman haruspices, and even the design of Roman temples all bear the imprint of Etruscan religion. What we know of Roman public ritual owes much to this earlier culture, whose emphasis on divination, sacred boundaries, and the integration of religion with civic life shaped the religious landscape of Italy for centuries. To reflect on the temples and rituals of the Etruscans is to see a society where the sacred and the civic were inseparable. Every city was a sacred foundation, every temple a center of divine presence, every priest a mediator of cosmic will. Their forgotten rituals reveal not only their devotion, but also their profound attempt to live in harmony with a universe they believed was filled with meaning. And as we let this vision settle quietly in our thoughts, we are reminded that their rituals, though long silent, still carry echoes of human longing for order, connection, and purpose. The Etruscans may be gone, their temples broken, their rituals forgotten, but their legacy endures in the calm persistence of history, whispering softly through time and carrying us gently toward rest. When we look beyond temples, tombs, and rituals, we find another dimension of the Etruscan world: its daily life, the rhythm of households, the bonds of family, and the unique place that women held within their society. Compared to many other ancient cultures, the Etruscans lived in a way that surprised their neighbors, for here women were more visible, more respected, and more central to both family and community than in the patriarchal worlds of Greece or early Rome. A typical Etruscan city was alive with activity from dawn to dusk. The streets were lined with workshops where artisans shaped bronze into tools, jewelry, and weapons, while others molded terracotta into figurines or tiles for temples. Farmers from the countryside brought grain, olives, and grapes into the city, their carts rattling through the gates to markets filled with goods. Merchants displayed pottery, textiles, and imported items from Greece or the East, while children played in courtyards and narrow lanes, their laughter mingling with the sounds of trade. At the heart of this daily life stood the family. The Etruscans valued lineage and ancestry, and tomb inscriptions show a deep awareness of family ties. Unlike the Romans, who identified themselves primarily through the male line, the Etruscans often recorded both the mother's and father's names, suggesting that maternal heritage carried weight in identity. This simple detail reflects a broader truth. Women were not hidden in the shadows of domestic life, but recognized as vital members of society. Women in Etruscan culture enjoyed freedoms that startled their Greek and Roman contemporaries. Greek writers, accustomed to women living secluded lives, remarked with shock that Etruscan women dined with their husbands, reclined at banquets, and participated in public events. Scenes painted on tomb walls show women sitting alongside men, raising cups at feasts, dressed in fine garments and adorned with jewelry. They were not excluded from social life, but embraced as partners, visible and respected. Marriage, too, carried a different character in Etruscan society. Women kept their own names and were remembered in inscriptions not as extensions of their husbands, but as individuals. Some evidence suggests that property could pass through women, and they may have held influence within households and communities. This visibility was so unusual that later Roman and Greek writers sometimes criticized Etruscan women as immodest, failing to understand that what they saw was not license, but respect. The home itself was a central place of Etruscan life, not only for family but also for ritual. Domestic shrines honored household gods, and meals often carried a sacred dimension. Food reflected the richness of their land: bread made from grain, olives pressed into oil, grapes turned into wine, vegetables and fruits grown in fertile valleys, and meat from cattle, pigs, or game. Banquets, as depicted in art, were not only feasts of abundance, but also symbols of unity, where families and guests gathered to celebrate both life and continuity. Children learned their roles early, imitating their parents in workshops, fields, or homes. Boys might learn crafts or military skills, while girls participated in household tasks and rituals. Yet, given the respect for women in the society, daughters too were valued, their names preserved in tombs, and their presence honored in art. Education and literacy was limited, but evidence of writing suggests that knowledge of letters extended beyond the priestly class, hinting at a society where communication through writing touched more than just the elite. Beyond the family, daily life included festivals and games. Athletic contests, music, and dance were not reserved for temples alone, but spilled into public spaces, blending entertainment with ritual. Women and men alike participated as spectators, and sometimes as performers, further blurring the rigid divisions seen elsewhere in the ancient world. This social freedom did not mean that hierarchy was absent. Wealthy families lived in larger homes, owned more elaborate jewelry, and occupied more prominent tombs. Slaves and servants likely supported the households of the elite, but the overall impression from surviving evidence is that Etruscan society was more balanced, less starkly divided, and more inclusive in its recognition of women than many of its contemporaries. In reflecting on the daily life of the Etruscans, we are reminded that civilizations are not only shaped by rulers and priests, but by the quiet rhythms of family, work, and community. Their society, with its recognition of women, its emphasis on lineage through both parents, and its vibrant social life, stands as a gentle reminder that the past was not uniform. Different cultures found different paths, and the Etruscans chose one that blended prosperity with dignity, ritual with joy, and family with respect. As we let this vision rest in our thoughts, we can imagine an evening in an Etruscan household. A family reclines together at a meal, lamps flickering, the scent of roasted meat and wine filling the room. Men and women converse as equals, children listen, music plays softly in the background. Beyond the door, the city hums with quiet life, artisans finishing their work, merchants closing their stalls, priests observing the stars. It is a world both distant and familiar, whispering across time that dignity and respect are not inventions of the modern age, but values that once thrived in the heart of ancient Etruria. And in that whisper, we too find calm, drifting slowly toward rest. When we drift into the artistic world of the Etruscans, we discover a culture that expressed itself not only through temples and tombs, but also through the objects of daily life. Ornaments, jewelry, paintings, and crafted goods that reveal their taste, values, and vision of beauty. Unlike the Greeks who carved marble statues of gods and heroes, or the Egyptians who built colossal monuments of stone, the Etruscans found artistry in the intimate, the colorful, and the detailed. Their art was filled with energy, movement, and symbolism, not designed to overwhelm, but to enrich life and connect it to the sacred. Jewelry stands out as one of their greatest artistic achievements. The Etruscans were masters of goldworking, using techniques so delicate that modern craftsmen still marvel at their skill. They perfected a method known as granulation, where tiny grains of gold, no larger than a grain of sand, were fused onto a surface to create intricate patterns. Earrings, necklaces, and fibulae, or brooches, shimmered with thousands of tiny golden dots arranged in geometric designs or floral motifs. To hold such a piece is to realize the extraordinary patience and precision of their artisans. These ornaments were not merely decorations. They were symbols of status, wealth, and connection to the divine. Women and men alike wore jewelry, and the presence of these objects in tombs shows that they were seen as essential in both life and death. Alongside gold, the Etruscans worked with bronze, silver, ivory, and semi-precious stones. They carved cameos, strung beads, and set gems into pendants. Shells from distant seas, amber from northern Europe, and glass imported from the east found their way into Etruscan workshops, where they were transformed into objects of beauty. This reflects not only their artistry, but also their wide trade networks, linking them to cultures across the Mediterranean. Their art was not confined to jewelry. Tomb paintings offer vivid glimpses of their aesthetic world. The walls of necropolises such as Tarquinia are covered with frescoes depicting banquets, dancers, musicians, and scenes of daily life. Unlike the rigid formality of Egyptian tomb art, Etruscan paintings are filled with motion. Figures recline on couches, raise cups of wine, play flutes and lyres, and move in graceful dances. The use of color is bold: reds, blues, blacks, and yellows, arranged in patterns that suggest both celebration and reverence. These images are not mournful, they are alive, showing us that the Etruscans viewed the afterlife as a continuation of the joys of earthly existence. Their sculpture, though less famous than Greek marble, was distinctive in its use of terracotta. Temples were adorned with large terracotta statues, painted in bright colors, representing gods, heroes, and mythical creatures. The most famous example is the Apollo of Veii, a life-size terracotta figure once placed on the roof of a temple, striding forward with energy and grace. Unlike the serene stillness of Greek statues, Etruscan figures often appear dynamic, captured in motion, full of life. This sense of vitality sets their art apart, reminding us that they sought not timeless perfection, but living presence. Decorative objects also reveal their artistry. Mirrors made of polished bronze were engraved with scenes from mythology, sometimes borrowing from Greek stories but reinterpreted through Etruscan eyes. These mirrors, often buried with women, combined practical use with storytelling, turning a simple object into a reflection not only of the face, but of culture itself. Pottery, too, carried both beauty and utility. While much of it was plain and used for daily storage, some pieces were painted or shaped into elegant forms, decorated with geometric patterns or scenes of animals and humans. Imported Greek pottery was also prized, showing that the Etruscans valued and engaged with the artistic currents of their neighbors. Yet even when borrowing, they made these objects their own, adding details that reflected their unique vision. Clothing and fashion, though less directly preserved, can be reconstructed through art. Men wore tunics and cloaks, often fastened with ornate fibulae, while women dressed in long flowing garments decorated with belts and jewelry. Their attire reflected both comfort and elegance, enriched by textiles woven in patterns that have not survived but are hinted at in paintings. Fashion was not only practical, but also a form of expression, revealing status, gender, and identity. What is striking about Etruscan aesthetics is its intimacy. Their art was designed not to dominate the landscape, but to enrich the human experience. Jewelry adorned the body, paintings decorated tombs, mirrors reflected daily life, and terracotta statues looked down from temple roofs. Each piece, whether grand or small, was part of a world where beauty and function blended seamlessly. This artistic vision reflects their broader culture, a society that valued joy, ritual, and continuity, that celebrated life even in death, and that expressed its values through the tangible details of craftsmanship. As we let this image rest in our minds, we may picture an Etruscan woman reclining at a banquet, golden earrings glimmering, a necklace of delicate beads resting against her dress, while musicians play nearby and dancers move gracefully across the floor. Around her, painted walls and decorated objects create a world of color and light. This is not a scene of distant grandeur, but of human warmth, a vision of art lived rather than merely displayed. And in that vision, we find the quiet strength of Etruscan aesthetics, a legacy of beauty that still whispers across the centuries, carrying us softly toward reflection and rest. Although the Etruscans are often remembered for their rituals, art, and religious practices, they were also a people who lived in a contested landscape, surrounded by rivals and allies, where trade routes, fertile land, and political influence were constantly at stake. To understand their place in the ancient Mediterranean, we must look at their military traditions, their weapons, and the way they engaged with neighboring powers such as the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and eventually the Romans. Warfare in Etruscan society was both practical and symbolic. Evidence from tomb paintings, grave goods, and written accounts suggests that the Etruscans viewed combat not only as a means of defending territory or expanding influence, but also as an arena of ritual significance. Some of the earliest gladiatorial contests, later adopted by Rome as public spectacles, are believed to have originated as funerary rites in Etruria, where armed combat honored the dead and symbolized the balance between life and death. This connection between warfare and ritual reminds us that for the Etruscans, violence was not simply pragmatic, but embedded in a larger spiritual order. Their weapons were crafted with the same skill that defined their jewelry and art. Bronze and later iron were forged into swords, spears, helmets, and shields. Graves of warriors have yielded finely decorated helmets, sometimes crested or engraved, that suggest not only protection, but also status. Shields were often round and sometimes adorned with symbols, while swords and spears varied in design, depending on the period and the influence of neighboring cultures. Archaeological discoveries show that armor was both functional and ornate, designed to display identity as much as to serve in battle. The Etruscans were skilled seafarers, and their power extended across the Tyrrhenian Sea. They built fleets that rivaled those of the Greeks and Phoenicians, using ships for both trade and war. Their naval power brought them into conflict and alliance with others, most notably in southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek colonies competed for dominance. In the famous Battle of Alalia, around the 6th century BCE, Etruscan and Carthaginian forces allied to confront the Greeks, a reminder that the Etruscans were not passive, but active participants in the great struggles for Mediterranean control. On land, their society was organized into city-states, each with its own ruling elite. These cities often cooperated in a loose league, but also competed among themselves, and this fragmentation sometimes weakened their military effectiveness compared to the centralized states of Greece or later Rome. Yet when united, they could muster formidable forces, drawing on their resources of metal, agricultural wealth, and skilled artisans who supplied weapons and armor. Relations with neighbors were complex. With the Greeks, the Etruscans both traded and fought. Greek pottery is found in Etruscan tombs, showing a taste for imported luxury, while Etruscan goods traveled south into Greek settlements. Yet battles over territory and sea routes created tension, and Greek writers often portrayed the Etruscans as fierce but decadent rivals. With the Carthaginians, by contrast, the Etruscans often found allies. Both powers shared an interest in controlling trade across the western Mediterranean, and their cooperation in naval battles reflects shared goals. The alliance with Carthage was a strategic choice, balancing against Greek expansion and securing influence over the sea that connected their worlds. Rome, however, was the neighbor that would eventually overshadow and absorb them. In the early days, Etruscans and Romans were deeply intertwined. Etruscan kings ruled Rome before the Republic, and many Roman religious practices and symbols were inherited from Etruria. Yet as Rome grew stronger, it began to challenge Etruscan dominance. Battles between Rome and individual Etruscan cities became more frequent, and by the 4th century BCE, the balance had shifted decisively. Rome absorbed Etruscan lands piece by piece, incorporating their culture even as their independence faded. Despite this decline, the Etruscans left a mark on Roman military traditions. The fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, symbolizing authority, was an Etruscan emblem that Rome adopted as a sign of magistrates' power. Roman gladiatorial games, as noted, likely evolved from Etruscan funerary combat. Even Roman engineering, in part, carried echoes of Etruscan techniques. In this way, the legacy of Etruscan warfare survived long after their political independence was gone. When we reflect on Etruscan warfare, it is important not to imagine endless conflict, but rather a society that balanced war with ritual, power with artistry, and strategy with spirituality. Their weapons were not mass-produced for faceless armies, but crafted with individuality and care. Their battles were not only about territory, but also about meaning, reinforcing the bond between human action and divine will. To picture an Etruscan warrior is to see more than armor and sword. It is to imagine a man whose combat was part of both survival and ceremony, whose shield bore not only the marks of battle, but also the symbols of belief. As we let this vision rest, imagine standing on a hilltop in Etruria, looking out across the valleys where fields stretch in calm silence today. Once those hills rang with the clash of arms, the cries of warriors, the rhythm of drums and flutes accompanying sacred rites. Now all is quiet, and the echoes of their battles are carried only in memory. The Etruscans fought, traded, allied, and eventually fell, but their story continues to whisper through the artifacts they left behind, reminding us that even in warfare, they sought balance between power and ritual, survival and meaning. And in that quiet reflection, we too find rest. The wealth of the Etruscans was not born from conquest alone, but from the soil, the mines, and the seas that surrounded their land. Etruria, the heartland of their civilization, was rich in natural resources and strategically placed between northern Europe and the Mediterranean world. From this fertile ground and favorable geography, the Etruscans built an economy that allowed their culture to flourish, sustain powerful city-states, and engage in trade networks that stretched far beyond Italy. The foundations of their wealth lay first in agriculture. The valleys of Tuscany and Lazio, with their fertile volcanic soil, produced abundant crops. Grain, olives, and grapes grew in plenty, forming the basis of diet and trade. Olive oil and wine became staples not only for local consumption, but also for export, carried in amphorae across seas to foreign markets. Herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs provided meat, milk, and hides, while fields yielded beans, lentils, and vegetables. The agricultural surplus supported large populations and freed artisans and merchants to develop their crafts, strengthening the economy further. Yet it was the mineral wealth of Etruria that truly distinguished the Etruscans. The hills were rich in iron, copper, lead, and tin, resources that were essential for weapons, tools, and trade. The Etruscans became skilled metalworkers, their smiths producing not only functional items, but also ornate jewelry, mirrors, and decorative objects admired throughout the Mediterranean. Iron from Etruria armed warriors and supplied trade partners, making their mines some of the most valuable assets in the ancient world. This abundance of metal drew merchants from distant lands, eager to exchange goods for the raw materials and craftsmanship of the Etruscans. Their ports became hubs of international trade. Along the Tyrrhenian coast, cities such as Tarquinia, Serviteri, and Populonia thrived as centers where ships from Greece, Phoenicia, and Carthage docked to exchange goods. Amphorae of wine and oil, metal ingots, finished jewelry, terracotta statues, and fine pottery flowed outward, while luxury items such as Greek vases, Eastern ivory, amber from Northern Europe, and exotic textiles arrived in return. Archaeological discoveries of imported pottery and Etruscan tombs show that Greek goods were highly prized, while Etruscan wares, stamped with distinctive designs, traveled southward to Greek and Carthaginian markets. The Etruscans were also expert seafarers, their ships navigating the Tyrrhenian Sea and beyond. They traded with Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily, extending influence into the western Mediterranean. In alliance with Carthage, they contested Greek dominance at sea, their fleets securing routes that connected Italy to Africa, Spain, and the East. Maritime trade was the lifeblood of their economy, carrying not only goods, but also ideas and artistic influences that enriched their culture. At the same time, local trade bound their city-states together. Roads connected inland communities to coastal ports, and rivers served as arteries of transport. Markets within the cities bustled with activity, artisans selling their wares, farmers their produce, and merchants their imports. The economy was not solely for elites, though the wealthy certainly benefited most. Ordinary citizens participated in these exchanges, and even modest households owned decorated pottery or simple jewelry, showing how prosperity trickled down into daily life. The wealth generated by trade and resources supported a vibrant artistic culture. The granulated gold jewelry, the painted tombs, the terracotta statues, all were funded by the surplus of an economy strong enough to allow leisure and luxury. Wealthy families commissioned elaborate tombs, adorned with imported goods and crafted objects, signaling not only status in life, but also preparation for the afterlife. In this way, the economy fueled not just material prosperity, but also spiritual and cultural expression. Yet wealth also attracted envy and conflict. The Etruscans' control of metal resources and trade routes brought them into rivalry with Greeks and eventually Rome. Their alliance with Carthage was in part a defense of their economic interests, seeking to maintain access to Mediterranean trade against Greek competition. Over time, as Greek colonies expanded in southern Italy and Rome rose in the Central Plains, the Etruscans found their economic dominance challenged, their ports contested, and their resources threatened. Still, for centuries they prospered, their economy a blend of agriculture, mining, craft, and trade. The balance of local production and international exchange created a society that was resilient, adaptable, and influential. Even after their political independence waned, the skills of Etruscan artisans and the wealth of their land continued to shape the region under Roman rule. Reflecting on their economy, we see a people who understood how to draw from the earth and sea, how to craft beauty from metal and clay, and how to connect their world with distant cultures. Their wealth was not built solely on conquest, but on resourcefulness, skill, and connection. It is a reminder that civilizations thrive not only through armies, but through trade, not only through kings, but through farmers, merchants, and artisans whose daily work sustains the whole. As we let this image rest in our thoughts, we can picture an Etruscan port at twilight. Ships are anchored, sails lowered, goods unloaded onto docks. Merchants tally their wares, artisans display finished jewelry, farmers bring baskets of olives and jars of wine. The air is filled with the scent of the sea and the quiet hum of trade. In that gentle scene lies the strength of the Etruscans, a people whose prosperity flowed from the balance of land, craft, and commerce, and whose whispers still drift to us across time, carrying calm reminders of how wealth and life were once intertwined. When we turn to the language and intellectual traditions of the Etruscans, we step into one of the most mysterious aspects of their culture. For unlike the Greeks and Romans, whose literature has come down to us in abundance, the Etruscans left behind only fragments of their voice. Their inscriptions survive on tomb walls, mirrors, pottery, and small artifacts, yet no great epic poems or philosophical treatises remain. What we know of their language comes from these traces, whispers written in a script that has been partially deciphered, but whose full meaning remains elusive. The Etruscan language was unique, not Indo-European like Latin or Greek, but belonging to a different linguistic family with only distant relatives in the ancient world. They adopted their alphabet from the Greeks, adapting it to their own sounds, and from this Etruscan alphabet, the Romans would eventually develop their own system of writing, which in turn became the foundation of the Latin alphabet we still use today. In this sense, every word we write in modern European languages carries a hidden Etruscan legacy, the echo of letters first shaped in their cities centuries ago. Their inscriptions are often short, recording names, dedications, or funerary messages. On sarcophagi and urns, we find words that identify the dead and sometimes the names of their parents, preserving lineage and family memory. On mirrors of bronze, engraved scenes of mythology are accompanied by captions naming figures, giving us a glimpse into how the Etruscans interpreted Greek stories through their own lens. On small tablets and objects, dedicatory inscriptions record offerings to the gods, revealing the sacred nature of writing as a tool of communication between human and divine. Perhaps the most famous Etruscan text is the so-called Liber Linteus, the Linen Book of Zagreb. It survives not in Etruria, but in Egypt, where it was cut into strips and used to wrap a mummy. Written on linen, the text appears to be a ritual calendar, listing ceremonies and offerings for different times of the year. Though only partly understood, it is the longest surviving Etruscan text, and gives us a rare glimpse into the complexity of their religious life and the role of writing in preserving it. Another significant find is the bronze liver of Piacenza, a model used by haruspices to practice divination. Divided into sections labeled with the names of deities, it reflects the way the Etruscans mapped the heavens onto the body of a sacrificial animal. Though not literature in the traditional sense, this object represents intellectual effort, a structured system of interpreting the cosmos, preserved through written form. The Etruscans also produced books written on wax tablets, though none survive. Roman writers mention that these books contained the Disciplina Etrusca, the body of sacred knowledge including divination, rituals, and cosmology. For the Etruscans, writing was not only for memory, but for guiding life, a sacred science that connected humans to divine order. Unfortunately, with the decline of Etruscan independence and the rise of Rome, much of this intellectual heritage was lost. The Romans absorbed parts of it, especially divination practices, but the texts themselves disappeared. What we have today are fragments, words carved on stone, lines etched on mirrors, faint inscriptions on pottery. These fragments, though incomplete, remind us of a people who valued writing not for entertainment or display, but for sacred purpose, for identity, and for ritual order. Their intellectual legacy extends beyond language. The very structure of their society, with its concern for boundaries, rituals, and divination, reflects a worldview deeply attuned to patterns and meaning. They saw the universe as ordered, governed by signs, and believed that through knowledge one could align with that order. This intellectual framework influenced the Romans, shaping their religion, their political symbols, and their sense of authority. To reflect on the language and writing of the Etruscans is to feel both the presence and the absence of a civilization. We can see their words, trace their letters, recognize their influence on the alphabet we use, yet we cannot fully hear their voice. Their stories, their songs, their philosophy, if they wrote them, are lost. What remains are whispers, inscriptions that carry names across millennia, and the silent endurance of their script within our own. As we let this thought settle, imagine standing before an Etruscan inscription on stone. The letters are clear, yet their meaning obscure, like a voice from the past speaking in a language we cannot quite understand. In that silence lies both mystery and calm, a reminder that history does not always yield its secrets, and that sometimes what endures is not clarity, but quiet presence. The Etruscans may not speak to us in books or poems, but their intellectual legacy lives in the very letters we use, in the rituals that shaped Rome, and in the enduring mystery of a language half understood, still whispering softly across time. As our quiet journey through the world of the Etruscans comes to an end, it is time to reflect on what this mysterious people left behind. Though their cities have crumbled and their language remains only half understood, the Etruscans did not vanish without a trace. Their influence flowed into Rome, and through Rome into the wider world, shaping traditions, symbols, and practices that endure even today. The Romans who conquered Etruria and absorbed its people inherited much from them. The very structure of Roman religion, with its augurs watching the sky and its haruspices reading entrails, was drawn directly from Etruscan ritual science. The concept of the Disciplina Etrusca, the sacred body of rules for divination and ritual, lived on in Roman practice long after Etruscan independence was gone. Roman magistrates carried the fasces, a bundle of rods with an axe, as a symbol of authority, a symbol rooted in Etruscan tradition. Roman gladiatorial games, famous for their scale and bloodshed, likely began as funerary rites in Etruscan culture, transformed over time from sacred combat to mass entertainment. Even architecture bore the imprint of Etruria. The Romans built temples with frontal approaches and deep porches, echoing the Etruscan style, and their use of the arch in engineering may have been encouraged by Etruscan innovations. In art, too, the Romans borrowed from their northern neighbors. Portrait sculpture, sarcophagi with reclining figures, and terracotta decoration all reveal the hand of Etruscan influence. The Etruscans were not erased but folded into Rome, their identity fading yet their legacy persisting. Beyond Rome, their contribution to the alphabet ensures that the whisper of their culture continues every time we write. The Etruscans adapted the Greek alphabet to their own needs, and from this adaptation the Romans created the Latin script, the ancestor of the letters used in much of the modern world. Thus, the unseen presence of the Etruscans lingers in every page of writing, in every word recorded across the centuries. Their legacy is not only in influence, but also in mystery. The undeciphered language, the frescoes of tombs showing banquets and dancers, the terracotta statues once bright with paint, the golden jewelry shimmering with granulated patterns. All of these fragments invite us to imagine a culture that lived with joy, ritual, and artistry. Though we cannot reconstruct every detail, what remains tells us of a people who valued community, who honored both men and women, who connected their lives to the rhythms of the earth and sky. In their silence, the Etruscans remind us of the fragility of memory. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fade, leaving behind traces that later generations must piece together. Yet even in fragments, their story speaks. The Etruscans show us that influence need not be loud to endure. They were absorbed into Rome, yet through Rome, they shaped an empire and, by extension, much of the Western world. Their whispers are still with us, in rituals, in letters, in symbols of authority, in ideas of sacred order. To reflect on their legacy is to realize that history is not only the tale of those who shouted the loudest, but also of those whose quieter voices shaped the foundations upon which others built. The Etruscans did not write epics that survive, yet they helped form the cultural soil from which Rome grew. They did not leave behind monuments on the scale of pyramids, yet their temples and tombs carried traditions into the future. Their identity may be partly hidden, but their influence flows quietly, enduring across millennia. As we close this journey, imagine standing in an Etruscan necropolis at twilight. The tombs stretch around you like silent houses, their carved stones weathered by time. The air is still, the sun sets in soft colors over the hills of Tuscany, and in the silence you sense their presence, not in words or shouts but in whispers. Whispers that reached Rome, whispers that reached us, whispers that remind us of the continuity of human experience. The forgotten rituals of the Etruscans are not forgotten entirely. They live in fragments, in symbols, in the letters we write, in the traditions we still follow unknowingly. Their story is a reminder that history is carried not only in memory, but in inheritance, not only in monuments, but in quiet influence. And so, as we let this final reflection settle gently in our thoughts, may the calm of their legacy carry us into rest. For the Etruscans are still with us, not as a vanished people, but as a whisper through time, a soft echo across the centuries, inviting us to listen, to reflect, and to drift peacefully into sleep. And so, our quiet story has come to an end. Before we begin the next one, I gently ask you for a like and a subscribe. It helps keep these calm journeys alive, and it means you can always return here whenever sleep feels far away. Now, let us continue, drifting softly into the next tale in our series of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we arrive at the ordinary life of the Minoans. Long before the myths of Greece were written down, before Homer sang of heroes and battles, there lived a people on the island of Crete whose lives were shaped by the sea, the sun, and the rhythm of the land. These were the Minoans, a civilization that flourished more than 3,000 years ago, creating a culture both mysterious and graceful. While much attention is often given to their grand palaces such as Knossos, with its labyrinthine halls and colorful frescoes. The ordinary life of the Minoans offers us a quieter, more intimate glimpse into how people lived day by day in a society that thrived in harmony with its environment. To imagine their world, picture the island of Crete lying in the blue waters of the Aegean Sea. Its mountains rise steeply, but valleys open into fertile plains where crops grow easily in the warm Mediterranean climate. The sea, always visible, brought fish, trade, and contact with distant lands. Villages dotted the countryside, built with stone walls and flat roofs, their houses clustered together for protection and community. Streets were narrow, winding between homes, and in the early morning air, one could hear the sounds of daily life beginning as women carried water, children played, and farmers set off for their fields. Agriculture formed the backbone of Minoan life. The people grew barley, wheat, olives, and grapes, staples of the Mediterranean diet that would sustain them for centuries. Olive oil was pressed in large stone vats, not only for cooking, but for lighting lamps and for ritual purposes. Grapes were turned into wine, which was consumed at feasts and perhaps exported to neighboring islands. Sheep and goats grazed on the hillsides, providing milk, wool, and meat, while pigs and cattle were kept closer to the villages. Beekeeping was practiced, with honey serving as one of the few available sweeteners, prized both for food and for offerings to the gods. In these quiet tasks, tending fields, pressing olives, keeping bees, we see the rhythm of ordinary life, steady and enduring. Inside their homes, Minoan families lived in spaces both simple and practical. Houses were often built of stone with wooden beams, plastered and sometimes painted. The interiors contained storage jars for grain, amphorae for oil and wine, and hearths for cooking. Furniture was modest, perhaps stools, low tables, and beds of wood or reed. Yet the walls were sometimes adorned with frescoes, even in modest dwellings, suggesting that beauty was woven into daily existence, not reserved only for palaces. Frescoes might show flowers, fish, or dolphins, images that connected the home with the natural world outside. Crafts and trades enriched this domestic life. Pottery was a common art, produced in a range of styles, from simple storage jars to elaborately painted vessels decorated with spirals, marine life, and plants. These pots served practical purposes, but also reflected a sense of artistry that pervaded Minoan culture. Weaving was another vital craft, with looms standing in many homes, producing cloth from wool and flax. Women were often responsible for spinning and weaving, their hands shaping the fabrics that clothed families and decorated households. Men might work as farmers, shepherds, fishermen, or craftsmen, shaping tools of bronze or carving wood. Some were sailors, taking goods across the sea to trade with Egypt, the Levant, and the islands of the Aegean. This connection with the wider world brought foreign objects into their homes: Egyptian scarabs, imported pottery, or exotic stones, integrating the Minoans into a broader cultural network. Daily meals were simple yet nourishing. Bread made from barley or wheat formed the staple, accompanied by olives, cheese, and vegetables. Fish and shellfish were common, caught from the surrounding seas, while meat was eaten less often, reserved for feasts or special occasions. Wine, diluted with water, was consumed regularly, part of both daily sustenance and communal gatherings. Feasts, whether for family or community, marked important events, and archaeological remains show that large quantities of food and drink were prepared for such occasions, suggesting that social life was as important as survival. Children grew up learning these rhythms of life, imitating their parents in fields, workshops, and homes. Girls may have learned weaving and household management, while boys trained in farming, fishing, or crafts. Play, too, was part of their world. Small figurines and toys found in excavations hint that even in the Bronze Age, children enjoyed games and objects made for amusement. Their laughter must have echoed through the stone houses and courtyards, softening the labor of daily life. Religion infused ordinary existence, though not always in the grand form of temple worship. Small shrines existed within homes, where offerings might be made to household gods or ancestral spirits. Figurines of goddesses, often linked to fertility or nature, have been found in domestic contexts, suggesting that each family maintained its own connection to the divine. Rituals were not distant acts, but part of everyday life, woven into the cycles of farming, birth, and death. the Minoans lived in a world shaped by the sea. Fishing was not only an occupation, but also a symbol, reflected in the frescoes of dolphins and octopuses that adorned their walls. The sea provided food, but more importantly, it connected them to other cultures, bringing ideas, art, and exchange. To be Minoan was to be part of a maritime world, always looking outward across the horizon, knowing that life was sustained by both land and water. As we let this image settle, we can picture an evening in a Minoan village. The day's work is done. Lamps fueled by olive oil flicker in the dusk. Families gather in courtyards, sharing bread, cheese, and wine. While the scent of the sea drifts through the air, children play quietly, elders tell stories, and the stars shine above as they have for millennia. It is a scene both distant and familiar, the ordinary life of a people who lived in harmony with nature, with family, and with the rhythms of the earth and sea. And in imagining this gentle world, we too can find calm, letting their quiet lives carry us toward rest. When we move beyond the walls of ordinary Minoan homes and look at how their society was organized, we see a civilization that valued community, family, and cooperation, perhaps more than rigid hierarchy. While later cultures such as Greece and Rome celebrated kings, warriors, and epic struggles, the Minoans built a world that seemed focused on balance, prosperity, and harmony with both nature and one another. The absence of large fortifications in many Minoan settlements has long suggested to scholars that their society was not dominated by constant warfare. Instead, the Minoans appear to have placed their energy into trade, art, and agriculture, and their communities reflect this choice. At the center of Minoan life stood the palace, not in the sense of a king's fortress, but as a hub of administration, storage, and ceremony. Palaces such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia were sprawling complexes with many rooms, corridors, courtyards, and storerooms. They housed officials, priests, and artisans, serving as both economic and religious centers. Here, goods from surrounding villages were collected, stored in vast pithoi jars, and redistributed, showing a system that valued organization and collective prosperity. Yet outside these palaces, ordinary families lived in villages that maintained their own rhythms. The family was the basic unit of society, and archaeological remains suggest that households were often extended, with multiple generations living under one roof. Grandparents, parents, children, and perhaps even cousins shared domestic space, working together to manage fields, livestock, and household tasks. This sense of shared life reinforced bonds of kinship and created strong networks of support. Women seem to have held a prominent role in Minoan society. Frescoes and figurines often depict women in positions of prominence, participating in ceremonies, rituals, and possibly governance. Unlike in many later patriarchal cultures, Minoan art does not relegate women to the background. Instead, they appear as priestesses, dancers, and leaders, suggesting that family and community life may have been more balanced in terms of gender roles. In households, women likely oversaw food preparation, weaving, and child-rearing, but their visibility in religious and ceremonial life indicates that their influence extended far beyond domestic walls. Children grew up within this framework of family and community, learning the skills necessary for adulthood through observation and participation. Boys may have trained in farming, fishing, or crafts, while girls learned weaving, household management, and ritual practices. Yet children were also part of the social fabric of play, and artifacts such as toys and small figurines show that their lives were not only about work, but also about joy and learning. The community itself was organized around cooperation. Villages shared resources, and festivals and ceremonies reinforced unity. Public spaces such as courtyards, often associated with palaces, suggest that gatherings were part of civic life, where people came together not only to trade goods, but to celebrate, perform rituals, and witness communal events. These events may have included music, dance, and athletic contests, all of which are depicted in Minoan art. Unlike later societies where rulers dominated the stage, Minoan imagery seems to celebrate groups of people, collective action, and the blending of sacred and ordinary life. Social stratification did exist, for palatial elites clearly enjoyed wealth and access to luxury goods, while farmers and laborers worked the land. Yet the evidence suggests that this hierarchy was not as rigid or militarized as in other Bronze Age cultures. The emphasis on trade, art, and ritual hints at a society where wealth and influence were tied as much to community networks and religious authority as to force or conquest. The role of religion in community life was profound. Small shrines have been found within villages, indicating that worship was not confined to palaces, but integrated into daily existence. Families may have gathered to make offerings to goddesses or household spirits, linking personal life with the wider sacred order. Community festivals, tied to the cycles of agriculture and the sea, likely brought entire villages together, reinforcing both social bonds and shared identity. One of the most distinctive features of Minoan society was the apparent importance of women in religious roles. Priestesses are depicted leading ceremonies, holding sacred symbols, and engaging in dances that honored the gods. This visibility of women suggests that Minoan society may have been more egalitarian than many that came after, with both men and women contributing visibly to community and ritual life. The absence of grand monuments to kings and warriors leaves us with an impression of a culture less focused on individual power and more on collective prosperity. While we must be careful not to romanticize, the evidence does paint a picture of a society that valued balance, community, and cooperation. Even their art, filled with images of nature, animals, and ceremonies, reflects a worldview in which humans were part of a larger order rather than conquerors of it. As we reflect on the social structure of the Minoans, we see a culture where family life, gender balance, and community cooperation created stability. Their society was not without hierarchy, but it appears to have been softer, more centered on ritual and trade than on domination. To imagine their world is to picture villages where families worked together, communities gathered for festivals, women and men stood side by side in rituals, and children played in courtyards under the warm Mediterranean sun. And as we let this image rest in our minds, we can feel the quiet harmony of their lives, a whisper across time that reminds us that even in ancient days, there were societies that sought balance, community, and joy in the ordinary. In that whisper, we too find calm, letting their story carry us softly toward rest. To understand the soul of Minoan society, one must look closely at their religion, for it was not something distant or confined to temples, but a living presence woven into the rhythm of daily existence. The Minoans lived in a world filled with sacred symbols, rituals, and myths that connected the human community to the forces of nature and the cycles of the earth. Their religion was both practical and profound, shaping not only ceremonies in palaces, but also small offerings in village homes and quiet gestures of devotion, carried out among fields, mountains, and the sea. At the center of Minoan worship appears to have been the goddess, or rather a series of goddesses, who embodied fertility, nature, and protection. Figurines of women with raised arms, often called snake goddesses because they hold serpents in their hands, have been discovered in palaces and shrines. These figures, with elaborate skirts and bare-breasted attire, suggest that female divinities played a dominant role in Minoan spirituality. The snake, a creature of renewal and regeneration because of its ability to shed its skin, symbolized fertility and rebirth, while the goddess herself embodied the life-giving power of nature. Other figurines depict women holding animals or flanked by lions, images that reinforce the connection between divinity and the natural world. Male gods or figures also appear, but usually as companions or consorts, not as dominant rulers. This has led scholars to suggest that Minoan religion may have been centered on a form of goddess worship, where the sacred feminine stood at the heart of spiritual life. Rituals were not confined to palaces. Shrines have been found in villages, caves, and mountaintops, suggesting that sacred space was everywhere, from the hearth of a home to the heights of a mountain peak. Offerings of pottery, figurines, and animal remains show that people carried devotion into every part of their lives. In caves, they may have left offerings to connect with the underworld or the mysteries of the earth. On mountaintops, they may have sought the favor of sky and weather deities. These rituals reflected a worldview in which humans were deeply tied to the cycles of nature: planting, harvest, storms, and the sea. Bulls held a special place in Minoan religion, as seen in the famous bull-leaping frescoes of Knossos. These images show youths, both male and female, grasping the horns of a bull and leaping over its back in an acrobatic display. Whether this was a literal ritual, a symbolic act, or a combination of both, it clearly carried deep religious meaning. The bull was a symbol of strength, fertility, and cosmic energy, and engaging with it in ritual may have represented humanity's dance with nature, a balance between danger and vitality. The myth of the Minotaur, later recorded by the Greeks, may echo these ancient rituals, transforming the sacred bull into a creature of legend. Offerings and sacrifices were part of Minoan worship, though they did not leave the clear records of other ancient civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests the sacrifice of animals, particularly bulls, goats, and sheep. Libations of wine, honey, and oil may have been poured as gifts to the gods, while food offerings were left at shrines. These acts were less about appeasing angry deities and more about maintaining balance between human life and the sacred forces that sustained it. Music and dance were essential parts of Minoan ritual. Frescoes show groups of dancers, often in circular formations, accompanied by flutes and drums. These dances were not mere entertainment, but embodied devotion, connecting participants to cycles of nature and the divine. The rhythm of drums may have mirrored the heartbeat of the earth, while flutes carried voices into the air, blending human sound with the natural world. Myth and ritual were inseparable. While we do not have Minoan myths preserved in written form, echoes survive in Greek mythology. The stories of Europa carried off by Zeus in the form of a bull, of Ariadne and the labyrinth, and of the Minotaur imprisoned beneath Knossos may all reflect transformations of Minoan symbols and rituals. These myths, though reshaped by later storytellers, preserve the memory of a culture that placed bulls, labyrinthine palaces, and powerful goddesses at the center of spiritual life. Even ordinary households contain traces of religion. Small shrines within homes held figurines, offering vessels or painted symbols. Families may have poured a libation of wine at the hearth, placed a flower before a figurine, or whispered prayers for fertility and protection. Religion was not distant but intimate, shaping every level of existence from palace ceremonies to the quiet rituals of daily life. As we reflect on Minoan religion, we see a culture where the divine was everywhere, in animals, in nature, in the sea, in the rhythm of dance, and in the strength of the bull. Their rituals remind us that they lived not as separate from nature, but as part of it, seeking always to maintain harmony between human life and the sacred forces around them. And as we let this vision rest, we can picture a festival in Knossos, the sun shining on a painted courtyard, dancers moving in circles, music echoing from flutes, a bull charging as acrobats leap with grace, while priests and priestesses raise their hands to the gods. It is a scene both vibrant and mysterious, a blend of art, myth, and devotion. And in imagining it, we feel the calm presence of a people who lived close to the earth, the sea, and the divine. In their rituals and myths, we find not noise but harmony, not conquest but balance, a whisper across time that carries us softly toward rest. When we turn to the art of the Minoans, we enter a world filled with color, movement, and an appreciation of beauty that extended far beyond palaces and temples into the rhythms of ordinary life. Unlike some ancient civilizations that expressed their power through towering statues or massive stone monuments, the Minoans created art that was intimate, lively, and connected to nature. Their frescoes, pottery, jewelry, and crafted objects reveal not only their skills, but also their worldview, one in which life was to be adorned with grace, where beauty was not reserved for gods or rulers, but shared across society. Perhaps the most striking evidence of Minoan aesthetics comes from the frescoes that once covered the walls of their palaces and homes. At Knossos, Akrotiri, and other sites, paintings have survived that still shimmer with color after thousands of years. These frescoes depict scenes not of kings enthroned or battles fought, but of dolphins swimming in blue seas, lilies blooming in fields, youths leaping over bulls, and women dressed in flowing garments adorned with intricate patterns. The emphasis is on vitality, on movement, on the harmony between humans and nature. One famous fresco shows a group of dolphins swimming gracefully, surrounded by fish, covering the walls of a chamber. It was not only decoration, but a statement about the close relationship between the Minoans and the sea that sustained them. Other frescoes show processions of women carrying offerings, musicians playing flutes and lyres, and dancers moving in elegant circles. These images reveal that art for the Minoans was not about eternal stillness, but about capturing fleeting moments of life, filled with joy and motion. Pottery was another canvas for Minoan artistry. Their vessels, whether for storage, cooking, or ritual, were often decorated with spirals, marine motifs, and floral patterns. Octopuses with outstretched tentacles wrap around jars, while seashells, starfish, and plants flow across surfaces in designs that echo the rhythms of the natural world. These designs are not rigid but organic, as though the sea itself had shaped the pottery. Even the simplest household objects carried beauty, suggesting that the Minoans sought to integrate art into everyday life, turning necessity into elegance. Jewelry, too, reveals their taste for refinement. Excavations have uncovered delicate gold ornaments, beads of semi-precious stones, and necklaces crafted with skill. Earrings shaped like lilies, pendants bearing symbols of goddesses, and bracelets decorated with intricate patterns show that Minoan artisans understood both the technical and aesthetic demands of their craft. These objects were not only markers of status, but also expressions of identity, connecting the wearer to symbols of fertility, nature, or divinity. What sets Minoan art apart is its lightness. Where other ancient cultures often created images of rigid gods and solemn rulers, the Minoans painted with fluid lines, bright colors, and a sense of freedom. Figures in their art are often shown in profile, with slender bodies, flowing hair, and expressive gestures. The energy of movement seems to flow through every line, whether in the leap of an acrobat over a bull or the curve of a flower bending in the breeze. Their art reflects not domination, but celebration, not severity, but vitality. Music and dance were also part of their aesthetic life, though little survives in physical form. Instruments such as flutes, lyres, and drums appear in frescoes, suggesting that music accompanied rituals, festivals, and daily gatherings. Dance, often depicted in processions and ceremonies, was both art and devotion, an aesthetic expression that connected humans with gods and nature. The Minoans also expressed their artistic vision through architecture. Their palaces were not fortresses, but open, airy spaces filled with light, designed with multiple levels, staircases, and courtyards. Walls were painted, floors decorated, and rooms arranged to create both functionality and beauty. The architecture itself was part of their art, integrating space, light, and decoration into a harmonious whole. Even clothing reflected their sense of aesthetics. Frescoes depict women in flounced skirts, fitted bodices, and adorned headdresses, while men wore kilts and jewelry. The garments were often decorated with patterns, suggesting that textiles were another medium of artistic expression. The care given to fashion indicates that aesthetics permeated daily life, shaping how individuals presented themselves in both ordinary and ceremonial contexts. What is remarkable is how art seems to have been democratized in Minoan society. While the palaces displayed grandeur, the presence of decorated pottery, jewelry, and frescoes in more modest contexts shows that beauty was not confined to elites. Art was everywhere, in homes, in shrines, in markets, and on objects used in daily routines. This integration of beauty into life suggests a culture that valued harmony, joy, and refinement, not only in ceremony, but in the smallest acts of living. As we reflect on Minoan art and aesthetics, we find a people who saw life itself as worthy of celebration. Their images of dolphins, flowers, and dancers whisper across the centuries that existence is not only about survival, but about finding joy in movement, color, and form. Their art teaches us that beauty is not luxury, but necessity, that it sustains the spirit as much as bread sustains the body. And so, as we let these images rest in our minds, we can imagine ourselves walking through the corridors of Knossos, walls painted with dolphins, lilies, and leaping figures. The air is filled with the scent of the sea, the sound of music drifts in from a courtyard, and every surface carries color and life. In that vision, we glimpse the quiet joy of the Minoans, a joy that still whispers through their art, carrying us gently toward reflection and rest. The Minoans were a people of the sea, and to understand their ordinary life, we must recognize how deeply the sea shaped their economy, their culture, and their place in the ancient world. Living on the island of Crete, surrounded by the blue waters of the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean, they were never far from the horizon, and this proximity gave them both opportunities and challenges. Their land was fertile, producing olives, grapes, and grains, but it was the sea that allowed them to extend their influence, building connections with distant lands, exchanging goods and ideas, and becoming one of the earliest maritime civilizations of Europe. Archaeological evidence shows that the Minoans built ships of impressive design, long and narrow, with sails and oars that made them swift and capable of crossing large distances. Their ships carried cargoes of oil, wine, pottery, and crafted goods, as well as textiles and metalwork. In return, they brought back copper from Cyprus, gold and ivory from Egypt, and exotic objects from the Near East. Their position at the crossroads of the Mediterranean gave them access to both East and West, making Crete a hub of commerce and exchange. The frescoes of Akrotiri on the island of Thera depict fleets of ships sailing in procession, decorated with bright colors and carrying passengers as well as goods. These paintings suggest that seafaring was not only practical, but also ceremonial, celebrated as part of their identity. To the Minoans, the sea was not a barrier, but a highway, linking them to other cultures and sustaining their prosperity. Their trade networks reached far. Excavations in Egypt have uncovered Minoan pottery, showing that their goods were valued in the markets of the Nile. In the Levant, objects from Crete reveal contact with the cities of Canaan and Syria. On the islands of the Aegean, Minoan influence is seen in architecture, art, and pottery styles, suggesting not only trade, but cultural exchange. Some scholars speak of a Minoan thalassocracy, a sea empire that extended influence across the islands, though whether this was political control or simply economic dominance remains debated. What is clear is that Minoan ships carried more than cargo. They carried culture, spreading motifs, techniques, and practices across the Mediterranean. Trade brought wealth to the palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia. Storerooms filled with large pithoi jars contained olive oil, wine, and grain collected as tribute or tax and redistributed as part of the palace economy. Merchants and sailors played important roles in this system, linking villages to ports and ports to distant lands. The wealth generated allowed for the flourishing of art, architecture, and ritual, funding the frescoes, jewelry, and festivals that we associate with Minoan culture. Yet trade was not only about material goods. Ideas too traveled along these maritime routes. The Minoans absorbed influences from Egypt and the Near East, adopting symbols, artistic styles, and perhaps even aspects of religious practice. In turn, they influenced the Greek world, passing on motifs, myths, and techniques that would shape later civilizations. The story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, though transformed into myth by the Greeks, may have echoes in Minoan rituals involving bulls and palaces with complex layouts. Such stories remind us that culture spreads as fluidly as goods across seas. The sea also shaped ordinary life. Fishermen supplied local markets with fish, shellfish, and octopus, staples of the Minoan diet. Sailors, whether carrying goods or accompanying fleets, lived lives tied to the risks and rewards of the sea. Villages along the coast looked outward, their people watching for returning ships, celebrating safe arrivals, and mourning losses to storms. The sea was both giver and taker, a presence both generous and dangerous. Yet the Minoans embraced it, painting dolphins on their walls, decorating pottery with octopuses, and integrating the imagery of the sea into their art and religion. Maritime life was also tied to ritual. Offerings may have been made before voyages, asking for protection from the gods. Festivals likely celebrated safe returns and bountiful harvests from the sea. The prominence of marine symbols in art suggests that the Minoans saw themselves as a people of the sea, their identity inseparable from the waters that surrounded their island. As we reflect on Minoan trade and seafaring, we see not only an economy but a way of life. Their ships carried goods, but also carried identity, spreading the influence of Crete across the Mediterranean. Their ports were places of exchange where local farmers, artisans, and merchants met sailors from distant lands. Their wealth was built not on conquest, but on connection, not on armies, but on fleets that sailed with confidence into the unknown. As we let this image rest in our thoughts, we can imagine standing on a Minoan harbor at sunset. Ships are anchored in the bay, their sails furled, their hulls heavy with amphorae. Merchants tally goods, fishermen mend nets, and families gather to welcome sailors home. The air is filled with the scent of the sea and the quiet hum of trade. In that scene lies the heart of the Minoan world, a civilization whose ordinary life was shaped by the extraordinary presence of the sea. a people who found prosperity not by walling themselves off, but by opening themselves to the horizon. And in their story, we too find calm, carried softly by the rhythm of waves into rest. To understand the ordinary life of the Minoans more fully, we must step into the streets of their cities and the courtyards of their villages to picture how people lived, worked, and interacted in the heart of their communities. Crete was dotted with both large palatial centers, such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia, and smaller villages that spread across the fertile plains and mountain valleys. Life in these settlements was tied together by a sense of community, by the markets that connected farmers and craftsmen, and by the crafts that gave shape to both necessity and beauty. A walk through a Minoan city would reveal narrow streets paved with stone, lined with houses built of mud brick and stone, their walls plastered and sometimes painted. Homes clustered close together, creating a sense of intimacy, while larger public spaces opened into courtyards where gatherings could take place. Water channels and drains suggest that even in the Bronze Age, these settlements cared for hygiene and organization. In the bustling heart of the city lay the marketplace, where farmers, artisans, and merchants brought their goods. Here one could find amphorae of olive oil, baskets of grapes, jars of honey, wheels of cheese, and loaves of bread made from barley or wheat. Fishermen brought fresh catches from the sea, octopus, tuna, shellfish, while herders sold meat and dairy products. The market was not only for food, but also for pottery, tools, textiles, and ornaments. Artisans displayed their wares, from delicately painted vases to simple household jars, from bronze knives to decorative jewelry. The marketplace was more than an economic hub. It was a place of social interaction where news was exchanged, alliances formed, and community bonds strengthened. Crafts played an essential role in Minoan society, and the quality of their craftsmanship was renowned across the Mediterranean. Potters worked at wheels, shaping clay into vessels that were both practical and beautiful. Some were plain storage jars for grain and oil, while others carried intricate designs of spirals, flowers, and marine life, reflecting the close connection between the Minoans and nature. Bronze workers crafted tools for farming and fishing, as well as weapons, though these seem to have been less central than in other cultures. Jewelers created delicate ornaments of gold, silver, and beads, their artistry admired in distant lands where Minoan goods traveled through trade. Weavers, often women working in their homes, produced textiles from wool and flax, dyeing them with colors from plants and minerals, creating garments both simple for daily wear and elaborate for rituals or feasts. Life in the villages followed a similar rhythm, but on a smaller scale. Farmers tended fields of barley and wheat, tended olive groves and vineyards, and kept herds of goats and sheep. Houses were simpler than in the cities, but still reflected the care of their builders, with plastered walls, storage jars, and hearths for cooking. In these villages, life was closer to the cycles of the land, marked by planting, harvest, and the seasonal changes that governed both work and ritual. Community was at the heart of Minoan life, whether in city or village. Festivals brought people together in celebration, combining feasting, music, and dance. Religious rituals often had a communal character, with offerings made in public spaces or in shrines that stood within villages. Public courtyards within palaces may have served as gathering places for large numbers of people, where ceremonies, performances, and perhaps even political decisions were witnessed. The sense of shared life was reinforced through these gatherings, ensuring that the bonds of community remained strong. Children grew up within this lively world, playing in the streets and courtyards, imitating adults in work and ritual. Toys such as miniature carts and figurines have been found in excavations, reminding us that childhood was a valued stage of life. Education was informal, passed down through families and communities, with boys learning farming, fishing, or crafts, and girls learning weaving, household tasks, and rituals. Yet the visibility of women in Minoan art suggests that girls may have been more integrated into communal life than in later cultures, participating in festivals and ceremonies alongside men. The contrast between city and village was not one of separation, but of scale. The palaces acted as administrative and storage centers, coordinating the collection of surplus goods and their redistribution. Villages supplied food, raw materials, and crafts, forming the backbone of the economy. The relationship was symbiotic, with both benefiting from the prosperity generated by trade and agriculture. What is striking about Minoan city and village life is the lack of emphasis on military might. Unlike later Greek polis dominated by fortifications, Minoan settlements were open and connected, suggesting a society that valued exchange and cooperation over conquest. This does not mean they were without conflict, but it indicates that their focus lay more on community, trade, and ritual than on warfare. As we reflect on the daily rhythms of Minoan cities and villages, we can imagine the hum of a marketplace at midday, voices rising as merchants call out their wares, the clatter of pottery being arranged, the scent of bread and olives filling the air, children weaving between stalls, and the sea breeze drifting through the streets. Later, in the villages, families gather around hearths, sharing simple meals, while music and laughter rise into the night. These scenes, ordinary yet profound, reveal the heart of the Minoan world, a society sustained by agriculture, enriched by crafts, connected by trade, and bound together by community. And in this quiet harmony, we glimpse not only their life, but their legacy, a whisper from an ancient island that still carries across time, inviting us to rest. When we explore the society of the Minoans, one of the most remarkable features that emerges is the prominent role of women and the sense of gender balance that seems to have shaped both public and private life. In contrast to many later Mediterranean civilizations, where women were often confined to the home and excluded from political or religious authority, the Minoans present us with a different picture, one in which women appear frequently in art, participate in ceremonies, and hold positions of visibility and importance. This is not simply speculation, but drawn from the frescoes, figurines, and artifacts that survive, which repeatedly place women at the center of religious and social life. Frescoes from Knossos and Akrotiri show women dressed in elaborate garments, with flounced skirts, fitted bodices, and adorned hairstyles, participating in processions, rituals, and dances. They are often depicted in positions of prominence, leading ceremonies, carrying offerings, or standing beside altars. Unlike Greek art, where women are frequently shown in domestic settings, Minoan women are active, public, and powerful figures. This visibility suggests that women played significant roles as priestesses and leaders in religious life, guiding rituals that connected their communities to the divine. Their presence in sacred contexts indicates that they were not secondary participants, but central actors in the spiritual framework of Minoan society. Within the family, women also held respected positions. Inscriptions and figurines suggest that mothers were honored, and fertility symbols indicate a deep reverence for the power of women to sustain life. The prominence of goddesses in Minoan religion likely reinforced this respect, for when the divine is envisioned in female form, it shapes how society views women in human form. Families appear to have been extended, with multiple generations living together, and in such contexts, the roles of women as mothers, daughters, and grandmothers were essential to maintaining the rhythm of daily life. In addition to religious roles, Minoan women may have had influence in economic life. Weaving, one of the most important household industries, was largely in their hands, and the production of textiles not only clothed families, but also provided goods for trade. Women's work in this domain connected them directly to the economic prosperity of their society. Jewelry, clothing, and the elaborate care depicted in frescoes suggest that women were not invisible in public, but expressed identity and status openly, contributing to the cultural vibrancy of Minoan life. Marriage in Minoan society seems to have been less restrictive than in many later cultures. Evidence suggests that women kept their names and were recognized in their own right, rather than solely as extensions of their husbands. In art, women are shown dining with men, reclining at feasts, and participating in public ceremonies, roles that shocked later Greek observers who were accustomed to female seclusion. The Greeks sometimes described Minoan or Cretan women as too free, a criticism that ironically highlights the greater balance and openness of Minoan society. Children were raised in this environment of family and community, learning through imitation the roles expected of them. Girls may have been trained in weaving, household management, and religious practice, while boys learned farming, fishing, or crafts. Yet the visibility of women in public life suggests that girls grew up seeing models of leadership and participation beyond the household, an unusual circumstance in the ancient world. This sense of gender balance extended into symbolic life. The dominance of goddesses in Minoan religion, whether as figures of fertility, nature, or protection, reflects a worldview where female power was central. Male gods existed, but they are less prominent, often portrayed as companions or consorts rather than supreme rulers. This balance in the divine mirrored the balance in society, reinforcing the idea that men and women both contributed to the harmony of life. The role of women in rituals such as bull leaping also reflects this equality. Frescoes show both men and women participating in this dangerous and symbolic act, suggesting that gender did not exclude one from sacred performance. Whether in festivals, dances, or sacrifices, both sexes were active, their contributions recognized and valued. What emerges from this picture is not a society without hierarchy or inequality, but one where gender roles were more fluid and inclusive. Then, in many ancient cultures, women were not hidden but visible, not silenced but represented, not confined but active. This visibility shaped both the family and the wider community, creating a culture that seems to have valued balance, cooperation, and shared responsibility. As we reflect on the role of women and family in Minoan life, we can imagine a scene in a Minoan town. A family gathered in a courtyard, women weaving cloth while children play nearby, men returning from fields or workshops, and in the evening all reclining together at a meal, sharing food, wine, and stories. In the marketplace, women move among stalls, trading goods and speaking with neighbors, while in the temple courts priestesses prepare offerings, their gestures guiding the community in ritual. It is a world where women and men live not in opposition but in cooperation, where balance is not only an idea, but a practice woven into the fabric of life. And in this vision, we glimpse the unique character of Minoan society, a civilization that found harmony in gender balance and family, leaving us with a whisper across time that life can be richer when both voices are heard. The heart of Minoan life was sustained by the land, the sea, and the foods that came from them. Agriculture and diet were not only matters of survival, but reflections of a society that thrived in harmony with its environment, using the fertile soil of Crete and the abundance of the surrounding waters to create a balanced and nourishing way of life. To understand the ordinary day of a Minoan family, one must first look at what they ate, how they farmed, and the rhythms of the seasons that governed their work. Crete's volcanic soil and Mediterranean climate provided rich opportunities for cultivation. The Minoans grew barley and wheat as staples, forming the basis of bread and porridge that were eaten daily. Olives were cultivated in groves across the island, their oil pressed in large stone vats and stored in massive jars known as pithoi. Olive oil was more than food. It was also fuel for lamps, an ingredient for ritual offerings, and a valuable commodity for trade. Grapes, too, were central, grown in vineyards that spread across the valleys and hillsides, pressed into wine that was consumed at feasts, family meals, and perhaps used in ceremonies. Alongside these staples, they cultivated legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans, which provided protein and variety. Vegetables, though less well preserved in the archaeological record, likely included onions, garlic, cucumbers, and leafy greens. Fruits such as figs, pomegranates, pears, and apples were also available, grown in orchards or gathered from the wild. Honey, produced by bees, kept in clay hives, served as the primary sweetener, a golden gift that flavored foods and perhaps played a role in ritual as well. Livestock contributed to the diet, though meat was not consumed daily by all. Sheep and goats provided milk, cheese, and wool, while pigs and cattle offered meat for special occasions. Evidence suggests that dairy products such as yogurt and cheese were common, giving families nourishment throughout the year. Hunting added venison, hare, and wild boar to the table, while fishing was essential. The surrounding seas teemed with tuna, mackerel, octopus, shellfish, and other marine life that sustained the population. Frescoes depicting fish and marine motifs highlight the cultural and dietary importance of the sea. Meals in Minoan households were simple but nourishing. Bread, cheese, olives, and wine formed the daily staples, while vegetables, pulses, and fish rounded out the diet. On ordinary days, families gathered around low tables, sitting on stools or mats, sharing food communally. Cooking was done over hearths, using clay ovens or open fires, with pots and pans designed for boiling, roasting, or baking. Amphorae stored oil and wine, while large jars held grain and legumes. Even in modest homes, the organization of food storage shows the importance of careful planning, ensuring sustenance across seasons. Feasting played a special role in Minoan society. Archaeological finds of large quantities of pottery and serving vessels suggest that communal meals were part of festivals and ceremonies. At such gatherings, meat was more likely to be served, accompanied by abundant wine, bread, and olives. Music, dance, and ritual offerings often accompanied these feasts, turning them into events that reinforced social and religious bonds. The act of eating was not only physical nourishment, but a communal expression of identity and unity. Agriculture itself was structured around the cycles of the year. Planting, tending, and harvesting required collective effort, with families and communities working together. The surplus from these efforts was collected in palatial centers, stored in vast storerooms filled with pithoi. These storerooms, discovered in places such as Knossos and Phaistos, contained thousands of liters of oil, grain, and wine, evidence of a system that managed resources on a large scale. The redistribution of these goods supported both the elite and the wider community, showing a society organized around cooperation as well as hierarchy. Religion, too, was tied to agriculture and food. Offerings of grain, wine, oil, and honey were made at shrines, symbolizing the connection between human life and divine forces. Fertility symbols, goddess figurines, and rituals involving animals reflect a worldview in which the cycles of planting and harvest were sacred, guided by the favor of deities. To plant was to participate in a sacred rhythm, and to harvest was to celebrate the generosity of the gods. The diet of the Minoans was not only practical, but also reflected their aesthetic sense. The variety of foods, the beauty of decorated pottery used to serve them, and the communal nature of meals show a society that valued the act of eating as part of cultural life. Even ordinary meals carried a sense of care, while feasts transformed food into celebration, connecting the human and the divine. As we reflect on the agriculture and diet of the Minoans, we can imagine a day in a Cretan village. The sun rises over terraced fields. Farmers set out with tools. Women prepare bread from freshly ground barley. Children help gather olives or tend goats. And fishermen bring in their morning catch. At midday, families share bread, cheese, olives, and figs, while in the evening, wine is poured, stories are told, and the community rests after a day of labor. These rhythms, simple yet profound, sustained the Minoans for centuries, creating not only prosperity, but also a sense of harmony with their land and sea. And in imagining their meals and fields, we too find calm, a reminder that sustenance is not only about survival, but about connection to earth, to family, and to the cycles of life that whisper across time. To understand the full rhythm of Minoan life, we must also look at how they approach death. For in their funerary practices we find both reflections of daily existence and glimpses of their spiritual beliefs. While much of their ordinary life has been pieced together from frescoes and artifacts, it is in tombs, burials, and rituals of the dead that archaeologists have uncovered some of the most telling details of their worldview. The Minoans buried their dead in a variety of ways, ranging from simple pits to elaborate tombs. In the early period, chamber tombs carved into rock or built above ground with circular stone walls, known as tholoi, were common. These tombs were often used for multiple burials, suggesting that family or community identity was more important than the individuality of a single person. Later, larnacs, small clay coffins decorated with painted motifs, became widespread, reflecting both practical needs and symbolic meaning. These larnacs often depict scenes of marine life, plants, and ritual, reinforcing the connection between the dead, nature, and the cycles of renewal. The use of communal tombs and repeated burials suggests that the Minoans viewed death not as the end of individuality, but as a continuation within the collective. Families may have gathered to place their dead alongside ancestors, reinforcing bonds across generations. This practice carried a sense of continuity, ensuring that the memory of the departed lived on within the tomb, surrounded by offerings and symbols of life. Grave goods also reveal much about their beliefs. Pottery filled with food and drink, jewelry, tools, and figurines have been found in tombs, indicating that the Minoans believed the dead required sustenance and possessions in the afterlife. Just as in daily life, bread, wine, and oil were essentials, so too in death they were provided, ensuring the journey beyond was one of nourishment and dignity. Figurines of goddesses or animals, may have been placed as protective symbols, guiding the deceased into the next realm. In some cases, weapons or tools were buried with men, while jewelry and ornaments accompanied women, reflecting roles in life carried over into death. The presence of ritual vessels suggests that ceremonies were performed at burials, perhaps involving libations of wine or oil poured as offerings. Music and dance may also have been part of funerary rituals, echoing the broader role of performance in Minoan religion. These rituals would have served both to honor the dead and to bind the living community together, transforming loss into a reaffirmation of social and spiritual bonds. The Minoan view of the afterlife remains partly hidden, for they left no written texts explaining their beliefs. Yet their art and burials suggest that death was seen not as an abrupt end, but as a passage into another form of existence. Frescoes and Larnac's paintings depict spirals, waves, and marine creatures, symbols of continuity, movement, and transformation. The recurring imagery of nature implies that death was understood within the same cycles that governed agriculture and the sea. Just as the earth renewed itself each year with planting and harvest, so too did the soul move through cycles of renewal. Comparisons with later Greek mythology hint at connections. The story of Europa, carried to Crete by Zeus, the myth of Ariadne, and the labyrinth of the Minotaur all echo themes of passage, transformation, and encounter with the divine. While these myths were reshaped by Greeks, they may carry distant echoes of Minoan beliefs about the soul's journey through life, death, and rebirth. Tomb architecture also carried symbolic weight. Circular tholos tombs, with their domed shapes, may have represented the womb of the earth, receiving the dead into the embrace of nature. Communal use reinforced the idea that death was a return, not to isolation, but to family and the earth itself. Later, when Larnax replaced large tombs, the painted motifs continued to express continuity, waves, fish, and spirals reminding the living that the soul moved in rhythm with the cosmos. The absence of grand monuments to kings or rulers again sets the Minoans apart. Unlike the Egyptians who built pyramids, or later Greeks who raised temples to heroes, the Minoans left behind tombs that emphasize community over kingship. Their burials speak of a society less concerned with individual power and more focused on continuity, ritual, and connection between life and death. As we reflect on Minoan funerary practices, we are reminded that their vision of death was not fearful, but integrated into the natural order. To them, death was not a break, but a passage, part of the same cycles that governed planting, harvest, and the sea. Families gathered, offerings were made, and rituals performed, not only to honor the departed, but to reaffirm the living bond of community and nature. And so, as we imagine a quiet Minoan burial, we can picture families carrying offerings of bread, oil, and wine, placing them gently within a tomb lit by flickering lamps. They whisper prayers, pour libations, and arrange the body with care, knowing that this is not an end, but a continuation. Outside, the sea murmurs against the shore, the earth waits to renew, and the stars shine as they have always done. In that moment, the Minoans found dignity, order, and peace in the face of mortality. And in reflecting on their rituals, we too may feel a quiet calm, a reminder that death has always been part of life's rhythm, a passage softened by memory, by ritual, and by the enduring whisper of those who came before. As we come to the end of our quiet journey into the world of the Minoans, it is time to reflect on what their ordinary lives reveal and what legacy they have left behind. Unlike later civilizations that emphasized conquest, kingship, or monumental power, the Minoans remind us of a culture that thrived in balance with its environment, in harmony with the rhythms of nature, and in celebration of beauty woven into daily existence. Their legacy is not one of empire or domination, but of art, community, and connection. When we look back at their society, we see farmers tending fields of barley and wheat, families pressing olives for oil, and vineyards spreading across the hillsides where grapes would be turned into wine. We see fishermen casting nets into the sea, bringing back tuna, octopus, and shellfish that nourished villages and filled markets. We see women weaving cloth at looms, their hands shaping textiles dyed in bright colors, while artisans shaped clay into vessels decorated with spirals, flowers, and marine life. These were not acts of luxury, but the fabric of ordinary life, repeated generation after generation, sustaining a society that endured for centuries. At the heart of their culture lay the palaces, not fortresses of kings, but centers of storage, ritual, and administration. Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia were hubs where goods were collected, redistributed, and celebrated in festivals that blended civic and religious life. Here, frescoes painted walls with images of dancers, dolphins, and bull leapers, capturing a vision of vitality rather than conquest. These palaces reveal a society where wealth and power were expressed not in massive monuments, but in organization, ritual, and art. Religion permeated their lives, from the snake goddess figurines that embodied fertility and renewal, to the bull-leaping rituals that expressed both danger and vitality. Sacred spaces were everywhere, mountaintops, caves, shrines within homes, reminding us that the divine was not confined to temples, but present in every part of life. Their myths may have been transformed by later Greeks into tales of labyrinths and minotaurs, but beneath the stories lies a culture where ritual and nature were intertwined, where humans sought harmony with forces greater than themselves. In social life, the Minoans stand out for their visibility of women. Frescoes show women leading ceremonies, dining with men, and participating in public life. Families lived in extended households, raising children within a community that valued both men and women. The balance of gender roles, the centrality of family, and the recognition of women in both domestic and religious life set the Minoans apart from many ancient cultures. Their art reflects a worldview filled with motion, color, and joy. Dolphins leap across walls, flowers bloom in painted fields, octopuses stretch their tentacles across pottery, and dancers move in processions that celebrate life. Unlike the rigid formality of many ancient artistic traditions, Minoan art breathes with vitality, capturing the fleeting beauty of existence. Their jewelry, textiles, and decorated objects reveal a culture where beauty was integrated into daily life, not set apart in monuments, but lived and experienced by ordinary people. Their maritime skill carried them across the Mediterranean, linking them to Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Greek islands. They traded oil, wine, pottery, and textiles, bringing back gold, ivory, and exotic goods. In this exchange, they were not conquerors, but connectors, spreading influence through trade, art, and ideas. Their ships were the lifeblood of their culture, sustaining prosperity and weaving Crete into the fabric of the ancient world. Even in death, the Minoans revealed their worldview. Communal tombs, larnacs painted with spirals and marine motifs, and offerings of food, tools, and jewelry show a belief in continuity, in life after life, in the cycles of renewal that mirrored the natural world. Death was not an end but a passage, and families honored their dead within rituals that reinforced both memory and community. When we reflect on their legacy, we realize that much of what we know comes not from grand inscriptions or monumental histories, but from the quiet traces of daily life. Pottery, frescoes, tools, jewelry, and tombs speak for them. Their language remains undeciphered, their literature lost, their voices silent. Yet in these fragments we find whispers of who they were, and in those whispers lies their enduring presence. The Minoans left no great empires behind, no armies of conquest, no sprawling monuments to kings. Instead, they left a legacy of balance, of beauty, of community, of a culture that celebrated the ordinary with extraordinary care. Their influence carried into Greek mythology, into Mediterranean trade, and into the very idea that life could be lived in harmony with nature and adorned with art. As we let this final reflection rest in our thoughts, we can imagine an evening in ancient Crete. The sun sets over vineyards and olive groves, fishermen return with their catch, families gather around meals of bread, cheese, and wine, and in the palace's courtyards echo with music, dance, and ritual. Above, the stars shine, as they have for millennia, constant over the rhythms of human life. In that quiet scene, we feel the essence of the Minoans, a people who lived in harmony with land and sea, who found beauty in the ordinary, and who left behind whispers that still reach us today. And so, as this journey comes to a close, let the calm of their legacy carry us into stillness, reminding us that even the simplest lives can leave echoes across time, echoes that guide us softly toward rest. And so, our quiet story has come to an end. Before we begin the next one, I gently ask you for a like and a subscribe. It helps keep these calm journeys alive. and it means you can always return here whenever sleep feels far away. Now let us continue, drifting softly into the next tale in our series of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we arrive at the dull administration of ancient Akkad. When people think of ancient Mesopotamia, they often imagine great kings, legendary conquests, and myths of gods and heroes. Yet beneath the surface of these tales lay the quiet machinery of governance, the slow and often monotonous processes that sustained the empire of Akkad. It is here, in the dusty corridors of administration, in the counting of grain, the recording of taxes, and the management of officials, that the real life of an empire unfolded. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around the 24th century BCE, was one of the first true empires in history, stretching across Mesopotamia from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. While Sargon and his successors are remembered for military victories and expansion, the empire's survival depended less on swords and more on scribes, clerks, and administrators who worked tirelessly to keep order over vast lands. At the heart of Akkadian administration was the collection and redistribution of resources. Agriculture sustained the empire, and the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates provided grain, barley, and dates. Officials recorded harvests on clay tablets, marking quantities and names of farmers. These records were not filled with glory or poetry, but with lines of numbers and signs, lists that preserved the flow of food from fields to storerooms. Large warehouses stored grain collected as tax, which was later distributed to temples, soldiers, and workers. Without the steady rhythm of collection and allocation, the empire would have faltered, for armies could not march and cities could not thrive without food. Scribes were the silent backbone of the system. Trained in the art of cuneiform, they pressed styluses into clay to record accounts, treaties, and decrees. Their tablets were stacked in archives, forming the memory of the empire. Each sign carved into wet clay represented not only language, but authority, transforming the words of rulers into permanent records. Day after day, scribes documented transactions, disputes, and inventories, their work repetitive yet essential. Though kings are remembered in legend, it was the scribes who ensured that promises, debts, and obligations did not vanish with the passing of time. The administration of Akkad also relied on a network of officials who supervised provinces. The empire was too vast for one ruler to control directly, so governors were appointed to oversee cities and regions. These governors managed local taxes, maintained order, and reported back to the central authority. Their correspondence, preserved on tablets, often dealt with mundane matters: shortages of grain, disputes over land, complaints about corrupt officials. The daily reality of empire was less about conquest and more about paperwork, a steady stream of clay documents that flowed like lifeblood through the administrative system. Temples played a central role in this bureaucracy. Far from being only places of worship, temples were economic institutions, owning land, employing workers, and managing trade. Priests worked alongside scribes to record offerings, track labor, and ensure that rituals were supplied with goods. The boundary between sacred and administrative was thin, for the gods were believed to watch over contracts and decrees, giving divine weight to the dull processes of governance. Even law was a matter of record. While Hammurabi's code is more famous, earlier Akkadian rulers also issued decrees and judgments, written on tablets for posterity. These laws regulated land ownership, trade, and marriage, binding the empire together through shared rules. Legal disputes were heard by officials, their decisions recorded in clay, often with witnesses named and oaths sworn by the gods. To read these records today is to see not drama, but daily life. Neighbors arguing over boundaries, merchants haggling over prices, farmers contesting debts. These were the ordinary concerns that occupied the courts of Akkad. Trade too was managed through administrative control. Akkadian merchants traveled far, bringing timber from the Levant, metals from Anatolia, and precious stones from distant lands. Their journeys required permits, their cargoes were taxed, and their profits recorded. The empire prospered not only by conquest, but by regulating exchange, ensuring that the flow of goods benefited the state. Behind every caravan and ship stood clerks tallying accounts, stamping seals, and writing tablets that ensured no measure of grain or shekel of silver went uncounted. The monotony of administration may seem dull to us, but it was the quiet strength of the empire. Armies could conquer, but only bureaucracy could sustain. Kings like Sargon and Naram-Sin might be remembered in legend, but their empires would have crumbled without the endless work of scribes, governors, and priests who ensured that fields were sown, taxes collected, disputes settled, and trade regulated. As we let this vision settle in our minds, we can picture an Akkadian official seated at a low table, clay tablets spread before him, a stylus in hand. Outside, the city hums with life. Farmers unloading grain, merchants arriving with goods, priests preparing offerings. Yet inside, the official scratches lines into clay, recording numbers, sealing contracts, managing the quiet machinery that keeps the empire alive. It is not glorious, it is not heroic, but it is steady, necessary, and enduring. In that dull rhythm of administration lies the true foundation of empire. And in reflecting on this, we find calm, for the Akkadians remind us that history is not only made by battles and kings, but also by the quiet work of record keepers, the forgotten hum of bureaucracy, the slow turning of the administrative wheel that sustained one of the earliest civilizations in the world. If the kings of Akkad stood as the face of power and the governors managed its provinces, then it was the scribes who gave the empire its memory. Without them, laws would have vanished, taxes would have been forgotten, and treaties would have dissolved into nothing more than spoken words carried away by the wind. The life of a scribe was not glamorous, nor was it marked by battle or spectacle, but it was essential, and in its quiet repetition, we find one of the most enduring rhythms of the Akkadian world. Training to become a scribe began early. Boys, often from families of some means, were sent to tablet houses, schools where they learned to master the complex system of cuneiform writing. Day after day, they practiced pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, copying signs again and again until they could memorize hundreds of symbols. Akkadian scribes needed to know not only their own language, but also Sumerian, for many older texts and religious formulas were still written in the earlier tongue. Their education included mathematics as well, since administration required accurate accounting of grain, livestock, and silver. The training was long and demanding, but those who succeeded gained a secure place within the machinery of the state. The daily life of a scribe was filled with clay. In offices near palaces, temples, and warehouses, scribes sat at low tables with baskets of clay tablets ready at hand. Farmers came to declare their harvests, merchants arrived to register contracts, soldiers brought reports from campaigns, and priests requested records of offerings. Each transaction was carefully recorded, the stylus pressing wedge-shaped marks into the surface. When finished, the tablet might be dried in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence. Once hardened, it became a durable record that could outlast generations. The work was repetitive, filled with lists, numbers, and formulas, yet it carried the weight of law and order. A misplaced sign could alter the meaning of a contract. A miswritten number could create disputes over land or grain. Accuracy was prized, and scribes were trained to be meticulous. Their tablets were often sealed with cylinder seals, small carved stones rolled across wet clay to leave an impression of symbols or scenes. These seals acted like signatures, giving authenticity to the document. Each official, priest, or merchant had his own seal, and scribes managed the process of sealing, witnessing, and archiving. In this way, every record bore not only words, but the mark of identity and authority. The scribe's world was also one of archives. Rooms lined with shelves stored tablets in careful order, grouped by topic: grain accounts, legal disputes, temple offerings, or diplomatic correspondence. Archivists among the scribes were tasked with retrieving older documents when needed, for the empire depended on continuity. Contracts might need to be checked years later, disputes revisited, or laws reaffirmed. To manage these clay libraries required patience and organization, for a misplaced tablet could mean the loss of vital information. While their work might seem dull, scribes held quiet power. They were often among the few who could read and write, giving them influence as intermediaries between rulers and subjects. A farmer might need a scribe to record his debt. A merchant might rely on one to draft a contract. And even governors depended on scribes to put their orders into writing. In a world where spoken words faded quickly, the scribes' clay preserved promises, obligations, and authority. Their position was respected, though not luxurious. Scribes were employed by temples, palaces, or wealthy patrons, receiving payment in rations of grain, oil, and beer. They lived within the heart of the city, close to centers of administration, and their social status was higher than laborers, but lower than elite officials. Their lives were steady, marked less by drama and more by the constant presence of clay dust, styluses, and tablets. Yet for those who valued stability, it was a secure profession, a path that ensured relevance in the empire's functioning. Scribes were not only administrators, but also preservers of culture. Some copied hymns, prayers, and myths, ensuring that stories of gods and kings endured. Others recorded astronomical observations or mathematical calculations, laying foundations for future knowledge. In this way, the scribes of Akkad bridged practical administration with intellectual tradition, their tablets serving both the empire's bureaucracy and its cultural memory. As we reflect on the life of a scribe, we see not a glamorous figure, but a diligent worker, seated cross-legged with stylus in hand, his concentration fixed on clay. Around him, the city bustles with farmers unloading grain, merchants negotiating prices, priests chanting rituals, and soldiers preparing to march. Yet within his small office, time slows to the rhythm of wedges pressed into clay, one after another, forming words that carry the weight of law, memory, and empire. It is a life of patience, precision, and quiet influence. And so, as we let this image rest in our minds, we realize that without the scribes, the empire of Akkad could not have endured. Kings may conquer, governors may rule, but it is the scribes who record, preserve, and transmit. Their lives may seem dull to us, filled with endless tablets and dusty archives, but in their quiet persistence lies the foundation of history itself. And in that realization, we too find calm, for their work whispers to us across millennia, reminding us that memory often rests not in battles, but in words, not in noise, but in the silent marks pressed into clay by hands long vanished. The power of the Akkadian Empire rested not only on armies and kings, but on the steady, methodical collection of resources. The dull but vital flow of taxes and tribute that kept cities alive, soldiers paid, and temples supplied. In this quiet machinery of administration, we find the empire's true foundation, for it was here, in the counting of grain, the recording of livestock, and the weighing of silver, that Akkad sustained its strength. Taxes were primarily collected in kind, for coinage did not yet exist, and wealth was measured in harvests and livestock. Farmers delivered barley, wheat, dates, and olives, filling storerooms with the produce of the fertile Mesopotamian plains. Herds of sheep and goats were also taxed, their wool, milk, and meat forming part of the state's resources. These goods were transported to central warehouses, often attached to palaces or temples, where scribes recorded quantities on clay tablets, ensuring that every sheaf of grain and every head of livestock was accounted for. The sheer monotony of these records is striking, tablet after tablet filled with lists, numbers, and names, the dull but indispensable rhythm of empire. Tribute was also exacted from conquered territories. Cities brought offerings of grain, metal, and crafted goods, not only as economic payment, but as signs of loyalty and submission. Governors in distant provinces collected these tributes and sent them back to Akkad, their deliveries carefully monitored and recorded. To fail in tribute was to risk punishment, for the empire relied on a steady flow of resources from its subjects. This network of collection required oversight, and officials were appointed to supervise each stage. Inspectors checked the fairness of weights and measures, making sure farmers were not underreporting and merchants were not cheating. Standardized measuring tools were used, and scribes ensured consistency, their tablets functioning as binding contracts. In this way, the Akkadian administration imposed not only taxes, but also order, bringing uniformity to practices across the vast empire. The redistribution of resources was as important as their collection. Grain from central warehouses was distributed to soldiers, workers, and temple staff. Oil-fueled lamps in palaces and shrines, while wool and textiles clothed officials and laborers. Food rations were often the primary form of payment for state employees, including scribes and builders. This system created a cycle in which the labor of the people sustained the empire, and the empire in turn sustained its workers and institutions. Though repetitive, this cycle was the quiet heartbeat of Akkadian governance. Temples were deeply involved in this process, They not only received offerings but also acted as centers of storage and redistribution. Priests worked alongside scribes to maintain accounts, ensuring that offerings to the gods were properly recorded and that temple estates contributed their share to the state. The sacred and the administrative intertwined, for the gods were invoked as witnesses to contracts and decrees, giving divine legitimacy to the dull routines of tax collection. Agricultural surpluses were carefully managed. In times of abundance, extra grain was stored in vast jars, sealed and kept for future use. In times of shortage, these stores could be released, preventing famine and ensuring stability. The ability to manage surplus gave the Akkadian state resilience, allowing it to endure fluctuations in harvests. Yet this management required endless accounting. Scribes marking tallies, inspectors sealing jars, officials overseeing distribution. The process was slow, meticulous, and utterly essential. The system of taxation also reveals the empire's reach into ordinary lives. Farmers and herders felt the weight of levies, merchants saw their goods recorded and taxed, and even artisans were required to contribute labor or products to the state. Taxes were not only economic but symbolic, reminding subjects of their obligations to the empire. Each delivery of grain or livestock reinforced the authority of Akkad, binding distant villages to the center through the steady pull of obligation. The monotony of the system is reflected in the tablets that survive. Page after page, line after line, filled not with tales of glory, but with numbers, amounts of barley, names of taxpayers, records of delivery dates. These dull records, baked into clay, outlasted the empire itself, reminding us that while kings may vanish from memory, the traces of administration remain. In their dryness, they reveal the true work of empire, not conquest, but maintenance. As we reflect on the system, we can picture a scene in an Akkadian storeroom. Rows of massive jars stand against the walls, sealed with clay and marked with symbols. Officials move slowly, counting, checking, and recording. Farmers arrive with carts of grain, their harvest measured and poured into the state's store. Scribes sit cross-legged on the floor, stylus in hand, marking quantities on tablets that will be stacked in archives. It is not a scene of drama, but of quiet diligence, the dull pulse of empire beating steadily through the rhythm of taxation. And in this rhythm, we see the true strength of Akkad, not in battles alone, but in the unending cycle of collection and redistribution, the daily work of farmers, officials, and scribes who sustained one of the earliest empires in history. Their lives, marked by repetition, ensured continuity, and their clay records whisper to us still, carrying the calm weight of administration across the centuries. The empire of Akkad, vast and sprawling across the plains of Mesopotamia, could not have been held together by kings alone. From Sargon to Naram-Sin, the rulers of Akkad depended on a network of governors and local officials who managed the day-to-day affairs of cities and provinces. These governors, stationed in the heart of provincial centers, carried out the dull but indispensable tasks of collecting taxes, enforcing decrees, settling disputes, and ensuring loyalty to the central throne. Without them, the grand vision of empire would have crumbled into chaos, for it was their quiet labor that transformed royal commands into practical order. Governors were appointed by the king, often chosen for their loyalty or proven service. Once in office, they became the king's representatives in distant regions, holding authority over both civic and military matters. Their responsibilities were wide-ranging, stretching from supervising agriculture to maintaining temples, from overseeing trade routes to commanding soldiers. They were, in essence, the linchpins of empire, binding local life to the central government. Yet their work was not dramatic but slow, filled with the endless cycles of administration. One of their central tasks was the collection of taxes and tribute. Farmers brought in their harvests, herders their livestock, and merchants their goods, all of which were recorded and forwarded to central storerooms. Governors ensured that quotas were met, that shortfalls were explained, and that surpluses were sent onward to Akkad's palaces and temples. Inspectors reported back to governors, who in turn reported to the king, creating a chain of accountability that was written into clay tablets and sealed with official marks. This process was repetitive, meticulous, and deeply dull, yet it was what sustained the empire's armies, officials, and rituals. Governors also acted as judges in local disputes. Villagers came before them with complaints about land boundaries, debts, or thefts. merchants sought resolution of disagreements over contracts. These cases were heard, decisions recorded by scribes, and sentences enforced. Law in Akkad was not abstract but practical, applied in dusty courtyards where neighbors argued and officials listened patiently before rendering verdicts. The governor's role was not to invent laws but to apply them, ensuring consistency across regions. Their work was steady rather than dramatic. Yet it was here, in these daily judgments, that the empire's authority was felt most directly. Temples fell under the watch of governors as well. While priests managed rituals and offerings, governors ensured that temple lands were cultivated, that workers were supplied, and that contributions flowed steadily. Temples were both sacred and economic institutions, and governors had to balance respect for the gods with the practical needs of administration. This intertwining of sacred and civic responsibilities gave their work an additional weight, for failing to manage temples properly risked not only royal displeasure, but divine anger as well. Military responsibilities were part of their burden too. Governors were tasked with raising troops from their regions when the king called for campaigns. They supervised training, ensured supplies, and commanded local garrisons to maintain order. Yet much of this military work was routine, patrolling roads, guarding storehouses, and deterring banditry. Only occasionally did it rise to the drama of battle. More often, it was the dull but necessary presence of soldiers in villages and markets, reminding subjects of the empire's reach. Governors also had to maintain roads and canals, the arteries of Akkadian life. Roads allowed armies and merchants to move swiftly, while canals carried water to fields and supported agriculture. Supervising labor for canal maintenance, ensuring repairs after floods, and organizing workers for construction were among the most tedious but essential tasks of governance. To neglect them was to risk famine, rebellion, or the breakdown of trade. In this sense, governors were less warriors than managers, overseeing projects that touched every aspect of local life. The relationship between governors and the central king was delicate. They were entrusted with authority but expected to remain loyal, and correspondence preserved on clay tablets reveals the constant flow of reports between provinces and the capital. Governors wrote of shortages, requests for supplies, complaints about corrupt officials, or warnings about unrest. The king, in turn, issued orders, sometimes granting resources, sometimes rebuking negligence. This chain of communication was slow, repetitive, and filled with formulaic language, yet it was the lifeblood of empire. To imagine the life of a governor is to picture a man seated in a provincial hall, surrounded by scribes, farmers, priests, and merchants. Petitioners approach, each with a case or obligation. Grain is counted, disputes are heard, seals are pressed into clay. Outside, workers dig a canal under the watch of soldiers, while inside the governor listens to reports, dictates responses, and oversees the endless flow of administration. It is not a life of glory, but of responsibility, not of heroics, but of maintenance. Yet in these dull duties lay the endurance of Akkad, for without governors, the empire's reach would have dissolved into distant chaos. As we let this image settle, we realize that the Akkadian Empire, remembered as one of the first great powers of history, was not held together by battles alone, but by the daily persistence of its administrators. Governors, with their endless reports and tedious duties, were the threads that bound villages to cities, provinces to the capital, and subjects to the king. Their names are rarely remembered, their work rarely celebrated, but in their monotony lay the strength of the empire. And in reflecting on their quiet labor, we find calm, a reminder that history often rests not on drama, but on the dull, steady persistence of those who keep systems running day after day, year after year. To keep an empire alive is not merely to win battles or conquer lands, but to feed people, to store resources, and to record carefully the endless flow of goods that moved from field to granary, from storeroom to temple, from village to palace. The Akkadian Empire, like many that followed, depended on a vast system of supply management that was dull, repetitive, and yet utterly essential. Within the walls of their cities, great storehouses stood, filled with jars of grain, amphorae of oil, baskets of dates, and herds of livestock counted and redistributed with methodical care. These storerooms were the hidden pillars of empire, for they ensured that armies could march, festivals could be held, and ordinary people could survive through times of scarcity. The system began in the fields, where farmers delivered part of their harvest as tax or tribute. Caravans of donkeys carried sacks of barley and wheat into the city, where officials weighed the goods using standardized measures. Scribes sat nearby, stylus in hand, pressing wedges into clay to note the quantities, the names of the farmers, and the dates of delivery. Once recorded, the grain was poured into massive jars known as pithoi, lined up in long storerooms where the cool air preserved them. Clay seals were pressed over lids, ensuring that each jar could be tracked, its contents verified against written records. To walk into such a storehouse would have been to step into a world of order and monotony. Rows upon rows of jars, each representing the steady labor of countless farmers, each a small piece of the empire's survival. Oil, too, was carefully stored. Pressed from olives grown across the fertile plains, it was used not only for food, but for lighting lamps, for ritual offerings, and for trade. Amphorae of oil stood alongside jars of grain, sealed and labeled. Dates, honey, and dairy products were also recorded, though these perished more quickly and were often distributed faster. Herds of animals were managed through similar systems, with tallies kept of sheep, goats, and cattle, their products, wool, milk, and meat, entering the cycle of collection and redistribution. Behind the storage system lay the archives, where clay tablets were stacked in shelves and bins, forming the paperless bureaucracy of Akkad. Each transaction, each delivery, each redistribution was recorded, creating a memory bank of the empire. Archivists among the scribes managed these collections, retrieving documents when disputes arose, ensuring continuity when governors changed, and maintaining the lifeline of administration. These archives were not glamorous but vast, dusty collections of clay that preserved the monotonous but necessary heartbeat of governance. In times of abundance, storehouses filled to bursting, the surplus ensuring stability. In times of famine or drought, these supplies were opened and distributed, preventing collapse. This ability to smooth out the fluctuations of harvest was one of the great strengths of Akkadian rule. Grain that might have rotted in one village could be transported and shared with another. Oil that overflowed in one region could be redistributed to temples and cities in need. The empire functioned as a great mechanism of balance, but one that required endless diligence and endless record-keeping. Corruption and mismanagement were constant threats, and some tablets reveal complaints about missing grain or dishonest officials. Inspectors were appointed to check storerooms, to break seals, count jars, and compare them with records. Their work was slow and repetitive, yet without it, the system could collapse into distrust. The presence of divine symbols on seals and tablets reminded officials that the gods themselves were witnesses to these transactions, adding a sacred weight to the otherwise mundane task of tallying jars of grain. Temples played a major role in managing supplies, for they were not only places of ritual, but also centers of economic life. Priests worked with scribes to track offerings, maintain storerooms, and ensure that festivals had what was needed. At major religious events, supplies from these storehouses were distributed in large quantities, feeding entire communities and reinforcing loyalty to both gods and rulers. The blending of sacred and administrative purposes gave the system both efficiency and legitimacy, for to steal from a storeroom was not only a crime against the state, but also a sin against the divine. Trade also flowed through these storerooms, for goods brought from distant lands, timber from the Levant, metals from Anatolia, precious stones from the East, passed through official hands. These items were often stored temporarily, recorded, and then redistributed as offerings, diplomatic gifts, or resources for craftsmen. Thus, the storehouses of Akkad were not only filled with food, but also with the tokens of international exchange, silent reminders of the empire's reach. As we reflect on this system, we see that the Akkadian Empire endured not only because of the brilliance of its rulers, but because of the dull persistence of its administrators. Behind every feast was a storeroom, behind every festival an archive, behind every army a tally of rations. The jars of grain and amphorae of oil stacked in orderly rows were the true foundations of power. To imagine their world is to picture a storeroom at dusk, lamps flickering, officials moving slowly among the jars, breaking seals, counting contents, scribes pressing styluses into clay, the air filled with the scent of earth and oil. Outside, the empire stretched vast and restless, but inside the storeroom, order reigned, sustained by the quiet monotony of record and storage. And in this monotony lay stability, the calm strength of Akkad. And so, as we let this image rest in our minds, we realize that history is not only shaped by kings and battles, but also by the dull, steady work of administrators who managed supplies, filled storerooms, and kept archives. Their clay tablets still whisper to us, carrying across the centuries the quiet rhythm of an empire built not only on conquest, but on jars of grain, seals of clay, and the patient diligence of forgotten hands. When we move away from the palaces, the governors, and the storerooms, we find the true foundation of the Akkadian Empire in the lives of ordinary people. Farmers, herders, craftsmen, and laborers made up the vast majority of the population, and it was through their steady work that the empire was sustained. Their lives did not often find their way into grand inscriptions or myths, but through archaeology and administrative tablets, we can piece together a picture of their daily routines, their struggles, and their quiet contributions to the first empire in history. For most, life began in the fields. Farmers rose with the sun, tending to barley and wheat that grew in the fertile soil between the Tigris and Euphrates. These crops formed the backbone of the Akkadian diet, providing bread and porridge for daily sustenance. Farmers also cultivated dates, onions, garlic, and legumes, while olive groves and orchards produced oil and fruit. Agriculture was not an individual task, but a communal one, requiring irrigation from canals that stretched across the plains. Maintenance of these canals was a constant burden, and entire villages were often mobilized to dig, clear, and repair waterways that ensured crops could grow. Without this communal labor, fields would dry or flood, and harvests would fail. Alongside agriculture, herding was common. Goats and sheep provided wool, milk, and meat, while cattle were valued for plowing and transport. Herders moved their flocks between pastures, sometimes ranging far from villages, returning with animals that supplied households and markets. These tasks were repetitive, shaped by the cycles of the seasons, yet essential for sustaining families and communities. Within cities, craftsmen carried on trades that added both function and beauty to Akkadian life. Potters shaped clay into jars, bowls, and lamps, many plain and practical, but some decorated with care. Bronze workers forged tools for farming and weapons for soldiers, their furnaces glowing in workshops where the air smelled of metal and ash. Weavers, often women working with wool from sheep, produced textiles for clothing, rugs, and trade. Brickmakers shaped mud into building blocks, sun-drying them in vast yards, their simple labor leaving behind the structures that archaeologists still uncover today. Markets were the meeting point of these worlds, where farmers sold produce, herders sold livestock, and craftsmen offered their wares. Tablets recording contracts and sales show us that trade was lively even at the local level. Merchants moved between villages, buying surplus and selling goods, while officials ensured that taxes were collected and disputes resolved. These markets were noisy, filled with the sound of bargaining and the smell of bread, dates, and oil. Yet behind the bustle lay monotony, the same cycles of planting, harvesting, weaving, and trading, repeated year after year, sustaining life in steady rhythm. The homes of ordinary people were simple, built of mud brick with flat roofs, often 1 or 2 rooms arranged around a small courtyard. Inside, hearths provided heat and space for cooking, while clay jars stored grain and oil. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a bed of reeds, low stools, and baskets for storage. Families lived close together, with multiple generations sharing space, their lives bound by work, meals, and rituals. Privacy was limited, but community ties were strong, as neighbors relied on one another for labor and support. Religion was present in these daily lives as well. Small household shrines held figurines of gods or ancestors, where families offered food, oil, or incense. While great temples dominated city skylines, ordinary people practiced devotion in their homes, blending work and worship in a seamless rhythm. Festivals and communal rituals allowed them to gather, bringing relief from routine and reinforcing bonds of identity. For many, service to the state was another part of life. Labor levies required men to work on canals, city walls, or construction projects for a set number of days each year. Some served as soldiers in the king's campaigns, marching far from home while their families maintained farms. Payment often came in rations of grain, oil, and beer rather than silver, tying ordinary life directly to the state's system of redistribution. Women played vital roles in sustaining households and communities, They prepared food, tended children, wove textiles, and managed domestic shrines. In markets, some sold produce or pottery, their contributions extending into the economic sphere. While their names are less recorded in tablets, their presence is visible in artifacts and in the daily continuity of life that kept families and villages functioning. Children grew up in this environment of labor and learning, helping in fields, carrying water, or tending animals. Their toys, small figurines, miniature carts, and clay animals remind us that even in an empire marked by bureaucracy and conquest, there was space for play, laughter, and the innocence of youth. The life of ordinary people in Akkad was not dramatic but steady, shaped by work, family, and the cycles of nature. To imagine their world is to picture a farmer walking along a canal at dawn, water glistening as it flows into fields. It is to see a potter shaping clay at his wheel, a herder leading goats across dusty paths, a weaver tying threads on a loom. It is to hear the sound of bargaining in a marketplace, the chanting of prayers at a household shrine, the laughter of children playing in a courtyard of mud brick walls. And in these scenes, we see the true heart of the Akkadian Empire, not in the palaces of kings, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary lives, whose monotony sustained greatness. As we let this reflection settle, we realize that history is not only about rulers and armies, but about countless nameless people who lived, worked, and died, leaving behind traces in clay, stone, and soil. Their lives whisper to us still, carrying across time the steady rhythm of existence, reminding us that even the dullest routines are the threads from which civilizations are woven. The Akkadian Empire, like every organized society, needed more than armies and taxes to hold together. It needed rules that governed daily life, guidelines for property, trade, marriage, and responsibility, and a system for settling disputes that inevitably arose among farmers, merchants, and neighbors. Though the famous Code of Hammurabi came centuries later in Babylon, the Akkadians already relied on legal traditions inherited from Sumer and adapted to their own growing empire. Their approach to law was not filled with dramatic trials or eloquent speeches, but with quiet hearings, careful testimonies, and endless tablets recording the small frictions of daily life. Courts in Akkad were not grand buildings, but rather designated spaces, sometimes in temples, sometimes in palace courtyards, and often in local assemblies where judges or governors presided. A case might involve a boundary dispute between two farmers, a complaint about an unpaid debt, or a quarrel over the sale of livestock. The complainant would bring witnesses, the accused would give a defense, and scribes would record the proceedings on clay tablets. These records, formulaic and repetitive, give us a window into the ordinary disputes that shaped community life. Much of Akkadian law was concerned with property. Land boundaries, vital in a farming society, were carefully marked, and disputes over encroachment were common. Witnesses were called to confirm long-standing divisions, and surveyors may have been summoned to measure fields. Tablets record the transfer of land through sale, inheritance, or marriage agreements, each sealed and witnessed to ensure legitimacy. The dull repetition of these records, lists of names, parcels of land, and quantities of silver, was what ensured stability in a world where memory could be contested and oral agreements easily forgotten. Trade disputes also filled the courts. Merchants who failed to deliver goods as promised, partners who disagreed over profits, or sellers accused of cheating customers all brought their cases before judges. Contracts written in cuneiform served as evidence, their seals carrying legal weight. If a dispute could not be resolved through witnesses, an oath might be sworn before the gods, binding the outcome to divine judgment. These rituals were less about drama and more about reinforcing trust, reminding all involved that the gods watched human dealings as closely as kings did. Marriage and family law were also present in Akkadian society. Contracts for marriage often specified dowries, property rights, and obligations, ensuring clarity in case of dispute. Inheritance was carefully managed, with sons, daughters, and widows receiving shares according to agreed traditions. Tablets recording such matters are not exciting reading, filled as they are with dry formulas, but they reveal the slow and steady effort to bring order to the most intimate parts of life. Crime, too, was addressed, though punishment varied. Theft was common enough to require strict oversight, and stolen goods had to be returned or compensated. False testimony carried penalties, for trust in witnesses was the foundation of the legal system. More serious crimes, such as assault or murder, left fewer records, but when they appear, they show a reliance on compensation, exile, or in some cases, harsher punishments. Yet even here, the law was less about spectacle and more about restoring balance within the community. Judges themselves were often local officials or respected elders, with governors presiding over more significant cases. Their authority was reinforced by the presence of scribes, whose tablets preserved the outcomes. Archives of legal cases ensured continuity so that precedents could be recalled and decisions enforced. In this way, the Akkadian legal system was both flexible and consistent, relying on communal memory supported by written record. The monotony of these legal records is striking, tablet after tablet filled with names, witnesses, oaths, and seals. Yet in their dullness lies their importance. Each represents a conflict resolved, a boundary fixed, a debt settled, a family inheritance secured. Without these systems, the empire would have fractured into endless disputes, its people unable to trust in contracts or agreements. Law provided the glue that held communities together, not through drama, but through steady, repetitive order. To imagine an Akkadian court is to picture a shaded courtyard where farmers stand before an official, holding their disputes in calloused hands. A scribe sits nearby, clay tablet balanced on his knee, stylus pressing marks into wet clay. Witnesses speak, oaths are sworn, and a decision is pronounced. The case is not remembered in epic or legend, but the resolution allows life to continue, fields to be plowed, and markets to remain open. It is dull, but it is the quiet heart of civilization. And so, as we reflect on the law and courts of Akkad, we find calm in their monotony. History often celebrates kings and battles, but the survival of societies depends on the ordinary settling of disputes, the quiet authority of law, and the persistence of scribes who recorded every word. Their tablets, though dry, still speak to us, whispering that stability comes not from noise, but from order, not from glory, but from the slow, steady rhythm of justice applied day after day. To understand the Akkadian Empire is to recognize that religion and administration were not separate spheres, but deeply intertwined, shaping the lives of ordinary people and the functioning of government alike. In Akkad, temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of economic and political power, where the sacred blended with the bureaucratic in ways that seem dull at first glance, yet reveal the quiet structure that held the empire together. Every major city had its temple, dedicated to a patron deity, and within these sacred complexes, life revolved around offerings, rituals, and records. Priests managed the daily ceremonies, presenting food, drink, and incense to the gods, ensuring that divine favor remained upon the city. Yet behind the rituals lay an entire network of scribes, accountants, and workers, for temples owned land, employed laborers, and controlled vast resources. Farmers who worked temple lands delivered part of their harvest as offerings. Herders contributed animals for sacrifice, and artisans produced goods for ritual use. These resources were carefully recorded, stored, and redistributed, turning temples into administrative hubs as much as spiritual centers. Temples also functioned as banks of the ancient world. Silver, grain, and valuable goods were stored in temple treasuries, safeguarded under divine protection. Loans could be issued from these reserves, recorded in contracts sealed with the names of gods, binding agreements not only between humans, but also under the watchful eye of the divine. To default on such a contract was not only a civic offense, but a spiritual failing, for the gods themselves were invoked as guarantors. In this way, the sacred weight of religion gave authority to otherwise mundane economic transactions, ensuring trust in a world without modern enforcement systems. The role of priests extended beyond ritual into governance. High priests were often members of the elite, connected by family or loyalty to the king, and their influence bridged the gap between palace and temple. Their responsibilities included supervising land management, overseeing workers, and maintaining archives of offerings and rituals. The daily repetition of sacrifices, bread, beer, oil, and meat, required constant supply and accounting, binding the temple to the agricultural and administrative cycles of the empire. The empire itself drew legitimacy from religion. Kings such as Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin proclaimed themselves chosen by the gods, their rule sanctioned by divine will. Naram-Sin even went further, declaring himself divine, wearing a horned crown and art that symbolized godhood. These claims were not merely for glory but practical, for they reinforced the connection between ruler and sacred authority, reminding subjects that obedience to the king was obedience to the gods. Administrative texts reveal how often religion and governance overlapped. Contracts were sworn in the names of deities, boundary disputes resolved with oaths before temples, and treaties sealed with offerings to the gods. The dull language of these tablets, lists of names, quantities of offerings, formulas of oaths, disguises the deep reliance of Akkadian society on divine authority to give weight to human agreements. Without the gods as witnesses, promises might falter. With them, even the most ordinary transactions carried cosmic importance. Temples also played a role in education. The training of scribes often took place under temple supervision, for the ability to write was tied to the sacred. Hymns, prayers, and incantations were among the first texts students copied, embedding religious tradition into the very foundation of literacy. Thus, every scribe who recorded taxes or contracts carried within his craft the imprint of temple teaching, a reminder that writing itself was seen as a gift of the gods. Festivals formed another vital connection between religion and administration. These were not only occasions of worship, but also times of distribution and redistribution. Food, drink, and goods stored in temple storerooms were released to the community during celebrations, reinforcing loyalty to both gods and rulers. The monotony of accounting, storage, and ritual found its purpose in these communal events, where the ordinary people of Akkad experienced the bounty of both temple and state. As we reflect on the role of religion in Akkadian administration, we see that the temples were the quiet engines of empire. Their priests, scribes, and workers carried out daily routines that bound economy, law, and ritual together. Offerings were measured, contracts sealed with oaths, archives filled with tablets, all under the watch of the gods. It was a world where the divine was not separate from governance, but woven into every layer of administration, giving authority to dull records and sacred weight to mundane routines. To imagine this is to picture a temple courtyard at dawn, priests carrying trays of bread and oil to altars, scribes seated nearby recording quantities, workers unloading jars of grain into storerooms, and merchants negotiating contracts sealed with invocations of the gods. It is a scene both ordinary and sacred, where the monotony of administration merges with the rhythm of devotion. And in that fusion, the Akkadians found stability, for the dull machinery of governance was sustained by the belief that the gods themselves were watching. And so, in the quiet repetition of offerings and oaths, of scribes pressing clay and priests tending altars, the empire endured, whispering to us across time that order rests not only on power, but on the sacred weight of the ordinary. When we think of armies in the ancient world, we often imagine the clash of spears, the march of soldiers, and the glory of conquest. Yet for the Akkadian Empire, as for all empires, the true substance of military life lay not in the brief moments of battle, but in the long stretches of administration, logistics, and supply that sustained soldiers year after year. The Akkadian army, remembered as the first professional standing force in history, was not held together by constant fighting, but by the quiet, repetitive routines of feeding, housing, and organizing thousands of men. It is here, in the dull machinery of rations, equipment lists, and supply lines, that the empire's military strength truly rested. Soldiers of Akkad were drawn from across the empire, some conscripted from farming communities, others serving as part of their obligations to the state. Their lives were shaped as much by waiting and marching as by combat. To keep them ready required careful planning. Grain had to be collected, measured, and stored for distribution to troops. Oil for cooking and lighting, beer and water for drinking, wool and leather for clothing. All of these necessities flowed into the army through the same administrative systems that governed the civilian economy. The empire's storerooms became military lifelines. Their jars of grain transformed into daily rations that kept soldiers marching. Clay tablets from later Mesopotamian contexts, which reflect earlier practices, show the monotony of the system. Endless tallies of barley issued to soldiers, lists of livestock slaughtered for meat, and allocations of wool for uniforms. Each soldier received a set ration, often measured in liters of grain, and officials were tasked with ensuring that supplies reached them on time. To miss a shipment was to risk hunger and unrest, for an army without food could not march, let alone fight. Behind every campaign stood caravans of donkeys carrying sacks of grain and amphorae of oil, their slow pace determining the rhythm of military movement. Equipment, too, was carefully managed. Bronze weapons, leather shields, and wooden spears were produced by craftsmen and distributed through the state's warehouses. Soldiers needed sandals, clothing, and tools for camp life, as much as they needed weapons. The administrative burden of equipping an army was vast, and scribes recorded each issue and return, noting when a spear was broken or when clothing had worn out. The durability of empire depended less on sharp blades than on the dull, repetitive task of replacing worn sandals and mending torn cloaks. Housing and camp organization formed another layer of routine. Soldiers were often stationed in garrisons far from their homes, where they lived in simple barracks or temporary huts. Here, their lives were filled with drills, guard duty, and maintenance work. Canals, roads, and storehouses required constant upkeep, and soldiers were frequently employed in such labor during times of peace. The image of a soldier digging a canal or repairing a city wall may lack drama, but it was this steady labor that kept the empire functioning. Discipline was enforced through order and record. Commanders maintained lists of their men, ensuring that rations matched numbers and that desertion was minimized. Oaths were sworn to the king, binding soldiers not only by loyalty, but by sacred obligation. Scribes again played a central role, recording pay, rations, and duties, filling tablet after tablet with the dull but vital memory of the army. Without these records, organization would falter, and with it the empire's strength. Campaigns themselves were shaped by logistics. Armies could only move as far and as fast as their supplies allowed. Roads had to be maintained, rivers crossed, and caravans protected. The pace of war was determined not by courage, but by donkeys, carts, and granaries. Victories remembered in inscriptions were made possible by the silent movement of supplies, the endless march of food and water carried across dusty plains. For every soldier holding a spear, dozens of workers, animals, and administrators ensured that he had the grain to eat and the leather sandals to walk. The empire's ability to project power depended less on flashes of battle than on the monotony of preparation. Even the spoils of war were absorbed into the same bureaucratic rhythm. Conquered cities paid tribute not only in gold or silver, but in grain, livestock, and manpower, all recorded by scribes and stored in the empire's warehouses. Soldiers, after the brief chaos of conquest, returned to the routines of garrison life, receiving rations, standing watch, and waiting for the next campaign. Their lives were more about order than violence, more about monotony than glory. To imagine the Akkadian army is not to see endless battles, but to picture a camp at dusk. Soldiers sit by small fires, eating bread baked from state-issued barley, drinking watered beer, repairing sandals and shields. Officials move through the camp, counting men, checking rations, noting names on tablets. Donkeys bray as caravans unload supplies. Scribes press styluses into clay by the flickering light of oil lamps. It is a scene of repetition, discipline, and quiet endurance. And in this monotony lies the real power of Akkad's army. As we reflect on the role of logistics in Akkadian military life, we realize that the empire's strength was not born in moments of battle, but in the steady hum of administration. Kings may be remembered for victories, but those victories were made possible by countless forgotten hands that carried sacks of grain, pressed clay tablets, and measured out daily rations. Their dull persistence, rather than any sudden act of heroism, sustained the first empire in history. And in their story, we find calm, for it reminds us that even the quietest, most repetitive tasks can shape the course of civilizations, whispering across time through the steady rhythm of supply and order. As we reach the quiet conclusion of our journey into the administrative heart of Akkad, it becomes clear that the empire's endurance rested not on the fleeting brilliance of battles or the legends of kings, but on the monotony of record-keeping, taxation, and governance. Sargon may have founded the first great empire, and Naram Sin may have declared himself divine, but their rule would have crumbled quickly had it not been supported by the countless scribes, governors, priests, soldiers, farmers, and merchants who upheld the dull machinery of order day after day. Their legacy, preserved in the clay tablets that have survived for millennia, reminds us that civilization rests on ordinary routines far more than extraordinary events. The clay tablets of Akkad, found in archives and storerooms, are rarely filled with drama. Instead, they list quantities of grain, deliveries of oil, tallies of sheep, contracts of marriage, and judgments in disputes. Yet in these repetitive signs, we glimpse the very fabric of society. People living, working, arguing, and finding resolution. What seems dull to us was vital to them, for it was through these records that fairness was maintained, that resources were tracked, and that obligations were enforced. Without such order, chaos would have swallowed the empire long before it left its mark on history. The storehouses and archives were as essential to Akkad as its armies. Jars of grain stacked in long rows, amphorae of oil sealed with clay, and piles of tablets pressed with wedges formed the hidden backbone of the state. These items, so ordinary, gave life to soldiers, priests, and common citizens. Festivals, campaigns, and daily meals all depended on the silent security of supply. The dull routine of checking seals, counting jars, and copying lists was as powerful as any sword, for it allowed the empire to endure droughts, famines, and the long stretches of peace when administration, not warfare, defined life. Governors and officials, though rarely celebrated, served as the threads that bound distant provinces to the capital. Their endless reports, filled with complaints about shortages or disputes, ensured that the king's authority was felt across the empire. Priests and temples merged the sacred with the administrative, giving divine legitimacy to contracts and decrees. Soldiers, too, lived lives more defined by rations and patrols than by battle, their discipline upheld by the steady flow of supplies. In this web of roles, each repetitive and unremarkable on its own, lay the secret strength of Akkad, a system that did not depend solely on the charisma of a ruler, but on the constant, dull labor of its people. The collapse of Akkad, when it came, was not because administration had failed, but because the pressures of environment and invasion overwhelmed even the best efforts of bureaucracy. Drought, famine, and attacks by nomadic groups strained the system beyond repair. Yet the very fact that the empire endured as long as it did was a testament to the effectiveness of its administration. When the empire faded, its administrative practices did not vanish. Later Mesopotamian states, from Babylon to Assyria, built upon the foundations laid by Akkad, inheriting the use of scribes, archives, taxation, and provincial governance. The dull machinery of Akkad became the model for centuries of rule across the Near East. In this sense, the most enduring legacy of Akkad was not its kings, but its clerks, not its battles, but its bureaucracy. To imagine the final legacy of Akkad is to picture not a battlefield or a coronation, but a quiet archive, shelves filled with clay tablets, each bearing the marks of a stylus, pressed by a hand long forgotten. It is to see a storeroom of sealed jars, each representing the labor of countless farmers and the careful oversight of officials. It is to hear the scratch of reeds into clay, the murmurs of witnesses swearing oaths before the gods, the measured voice of a governor resolving a dispute. These are not moments that echo with glory, but they are the moments that allowed life to continue in order and stability. And as we reflect on this legacy, we find a calm reminder that civilizations are not built only on grand gestures, but on the quiet persistence of ordinary tasks. The Akkadians remind us that history's foundation lies in the dull but necessary routines that sustain life: the counting of grain, the sealing of contracts, the training of scribes, the redistribution of supplies. It is in the monotony of these actions that empires endure. And so, as this tale of the dull administration of Akkad comes to a close, let us picture once more the calm hum of ancient bureaucracy, the stylus pressing into clay, the official sealing a jar, the scribe stacking tablets in an archive. It is not dramatic, it is not glorious, but it is steady, and in its steadiness lies the strength of one of the first great empires of history. And in imagining this quiet endurance, we too may drift into rest, carried softly by the realization that even the dullest routines can leave echoes across time. Thank you for choosing to spend this night with Sleepy Whisper. May your sleep be deep, and when morning comes, may your day be filled with good fortune, gentle moments, and success in all your work. We'll meet again tomorrow night here at Sleepy Whisper. Until then, rest well, and good night.